Good morning, everybody. I hope you guys are doing all right. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is Jamal Thomas Morning Show. Um, Interesting day, right? Interesting day. You've had the Alaska Summit. I gave my analysis of that summit. I think my analysis of that summit was dead on, especially considering the events that have taken place after that summit. Leading up to that summit, there were various points of view about the, let's say, gravity and the purpose of that particular summit. And the more cynical points of view, I think, have been found to be incorrect. That all things being equal, it seems that there were negotiations taking place behind the scenes. It seems that when Wickoff went this one last time, and I guess there are two things. One, the negotiations that took place at Alaska come with any context. It's not just, let's just talk. Obviously, they had been talking the entire way through, regardless of what the Europeans knew. It seems that the Trump administration, either through back channel and through direct communication, had been having a conversation about the Ukraine war all the way through. When it became clear that Donbass was going to be taken, when the Ukrainian military was buckling, when Russia was flanking the last two defensive positions, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, that, what is it called? It'll come to me in a moment. But flanking the last two defensive positions in the Donbass region. And to make it even worse, that the Ukrainian military was incapable of plugging their gaps because of the 400,000 people that had deserted, because of the 1.5 million that had been killed, and because Russia had two militaries waiting in the background in order to intervene at some point. It's a rout. It was clearly a rout. The speed of the Russian advance that was once described as a lava flow, inexorable as gravity itself, was becoming far more faster, quicker, and was pressing on so many fronts that anytime Ukraine moved in order to cover one front, they open up another front. It became clear that the situation on the ground was untenable. And as it was untenable, as I keep pointing out, between the US or Ukraine fundamentally collapsing versus I need to save face is going to win out. To be very clear, this is not the US saying, let's have a permanent deal in perpetuity where we are going to hold hands and run into the lilies under the moonlight. It's not that. It's not that Trump is, oh my God, there's so many people that are dying. Donald Trump bleeds for these Ukraine. It's not that. It is an American president looking at a war that was provoked by the Americans, that was backed by the Europeans, and a fundamental collapse in the context of what they were trying to accomplish, as opposed to having the overt humiliation of all of Donbass collapsing with the Russian military looking for the next target. Donald Trump, tactically, is withdrawing. Tactical withdrawal. Primacy has not gone anywhere. If you look at what has taken place with Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the United States association with them effectively going after the soft underbelly of Russia, again, if primacy had left, that deal doesn't take place with these two countries now working in coordination with the United States. I hope you get my point. It wasn't about lemon light. It wasn't that the US president just wanted to make a peace deal. Do you honestly believe that if Donald Trump was winning and had an advantage, that he would be doing this deal under these terms? And what I mean by that is Zelensky is being called to the White House for practically a surrender. The United States and Russia join hands. We agree. And what's wild in that press conference, because a lot of channels was like, oh, this is nothing. This is nothing. And as I went through the press conference, gave my analysis, I pointed out, no, this is something. Both sides sound very similar. Both sides are saying that they have an agreement. And then you get Trump making the call to Zelensky, effectively saying, take the deal. Take the deal, or else you will continue to lose more and more and more. Take the deal. Putin and I have come to an agreement. And we believe that you should take this deal, which caused a collective freakout of hysterics in Europe. Zelensky was summoned to the White House, take place today. In fact, there's a bit of footage from that with them sitting in the Oval Office talking. Zelensky doesn't necessarily seem all that happy, but obviously he is still, at the very least, at a distance, being obstinate. Now, the question really does boil down to whether or not Donald Trump is willing to walk. Is this a context by which he knows that Europe is going to say no? I don't know how Zelensky says no to anything, frankly, considering he's a proxy. But all things being equal, Donald Trump could say, fair enough. This was our offer. I am walking. I'm out. You guys figure it out. You can buy weapons from us. We're out. Figure it out on your own. Now, in all the reporting that has been taking place on this particular subject matter, it seems that Europe is freaked out by that. They don't want Daddy to leave. Now, Daddy can have a conversation with Zelensky first, then the rest of them, a carnival of lunatics, morons, and degenerates that have effectively come in tow with Zelensky because they're terrified that Trump is going to bully him at the meeting like took place before. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump could just say, you all are horrible people. I'm walking. They're terrified that Daddy leaves. That Trump says, I'm going to get some milk. I'll be back. Packs a suitcase. Daddy, do you really need to pack your suitcase for milk? Yes. Yes. I'm out. Trunk shuts. Door slams. Car pulls off. You see Daddy in 20 years. Meaning, ultimately, Daddy can always walk. Which, if they push him, if they piss him off, will he do it? Is all of this a context for Trump to walk? Is this a context for Trump to walk? Or does Trump bully them into taking the deal? Fascinating. Zelensky is at the White House. There's footage that has come out with Zelensky at the White House. Let's take a look while we have the opportunity. Yeah, he doesn't seem happy. He does not seem happy in the least. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't seem happy. He does not seem happy. But either way, we're going to get results from that meeting, and we will see how it turns out. Let me bring my man in. We are joined with the man himself, Brian Berletic. He is host, creator of the New Atlas. Again, a damn good show. Brian is singing praises all the time on that show. As I've said before I even knew who you were, I had been saving your videos because of your good analysis and there was one in particular where you explained something so well. And I was like, whoa, that's a good explanation. Save. So I'm glad you could join me and have this conversation. How you doing, man? You doing all right?
I'm doing very well. Was the video about continuity of agenda and how many times the U.S. has pretended to reset with Russia before completely betraying every promise or suggestion it itself made, and then continuing pursuit of hegemony? Was it that?
I don't know if it was that one. It was one of them though. But to be clear, as I pointed out to my audience, it's not like primacy has stopped. Right? It's not like the U.S. is like, all right, we're going to go into the lilies under the moonlight with Russia arm in arm. It's not that. It's not that, right? It's like the moment that the U.S. gets some level of advantage, this will be torn up, just like the other agreements have been torn up. But give me your take on the A, Alaska summit, and B, what do you think? Look, I call it surrender, frankly. Zelensky is being summoned to the White House to be told, all right, proxy, you fought hard, pat you on the back. Time to call it a day. You're failing in Donbass. It's going to be humiliating when it collapses. Let's wrap this up. But give me your take. I'm curious on your take. I've been curious on your take ever since I've actually come on. Give me your thoughts.
So we remember the United States laying out its entire plan It actually started to reveal it during the Biden administration, but then U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth openly said what the plan was. The U.S. has resource scarcity. They cannot fight a proxy war against Russia and also China at the same time. And they have made the decision to prioritize China. And that is because of China's exponential rise. It is rising very quickly, it is reaching critical mass. When it reaches a certain point, it will be irreversible. It will irreversibly and permanently surpass not just the US, but the entirety of all of the West. And that will not be able to be reversed. So they are very desperate to do this. They do not have resources to continue this conflict in Ukraine against Russia on their own, and also pursue war with China in the Asia-Pacific region. So Secretary Hegseth openly said, we can't do it. Europe, you need to step up and do this. And we're going to pivot toward China. It doesn't mean that the United States isn't still going to be running the proxy war. Of course they are. There are still US generals in Germany at the top of Ukraine's armed forces chain of command. The CIA still runs Ukraine's intelligence agencies. They're still carrying out attacks right now inside of Russia against killing Russians right now. And so what we see is the United States positioning to make this pivot, to hand it off to Europe and either freeze it, essentially freeze it one way or another. That's what they're doing. They're not ending it. They have no interest in peace with Russia. As others have pointed out, as I've pointed out, even as President Trump invited President Putin to make peace, pursuing peace, it said in the background during the Alaska summit, the United States is still checking off all the boxes on its extending Russia policy, which is to encircle and contain Russia along its entire periphery, not just in Ukraine, but in the Middle East, where there are Russian allies still, including Iran. The Caucasus region, we just watched the United States take over a piece of land that is essentially between Russia and Iran, a 99-year lease. And this is Armenia, Azerbaijan. This is literally a chapter in the Extending Russia 2019 RAND Corporation paper. So they're still doing all of this. So they're still encircling and containing Russia, but they have to admit that the proxy war is not going well. They knew it wouldn't go well. In that 2019 paper, they say Ukraine is going to end up destroyed. It's just a matter of when. And the final tally once everything is over. But they knew that was going to happen. So it's going to run its course, and then they're going to move on to other things. Just like you say, they're still pursuing primacy. That has been American foreign policy for over a century. That is not going to change. President Trump isn't even pretending he's going to change that. He's just selling it as MAGA, as America first. But he's still talking about imposing American primacy on the entire planet, coercing other nations inside their own borders regarding how they run their business and their affairs. So that's what this talk was. And you said it before I came on. You were talking about how Ukraine and Europe are American proxies. These people have been installed into power by Washington, by Wall Street. They're completely controlled. There's zero agency. That was the whole point of creating the European Union, to eliminate European agency. And that is what they have done. And so what's with this circus where they're pretending, well, we're horrified by what the US is doing? Secretary Hegseth told them in February, you are going to take over. You need to expand NATO funding, ramp up in military industrial production, double down on arming and supporting Ukraine because we're pivoting toward China. And they all lined up and agreed to all of this. Obediently, since then, they have been implementing it step by step. So why are they pretending that they're so shocked by this? This is what they were told to do. This is what they are preparing to do. The reason is very simple. People in Europe, the European public, are going to ask, why are we spending all of this money, taking funding from our social programs here in Europe and wasting it on this war in Ukraine? European puppets installed by the US cannot tell the European public because the US doesn't have enough resources to fight for their empire. They want us to do it. Are you okay with that? And they will say no. If they play this circus, this game where they pretend Trump is he's so evil, he's hijacked American foreign policy, he's abandoning us to the Russians, and if we don't stand up and fight the Russians will just flow like a wave of darkness over all of us, then they can sell that to the European public, right? So it's about perception management. It is about the US making this pivot as part of its division of labor and strategic sequencing. But as I think we agree, the US is far from finished with attempting to encircle, contain, encroach upon, and eventually destroy the Russian Federation.
Agreed. Yeah, I don't. Primacy is not giving up an agenda. Like for the people who come on the show and they were like, yeah, I think Trump wants this multipolar world. It's like, so he wants a multipolar world and yet he's imposing tariffs on the entirety of the planet and is bullying one country after the next. It's like, that doesn't sound like multipolarity to me. That sounds like, okay, we can't afford to do all of this at once. So we need to pass this stuff off. Now, I would disagree with one thing. I really do think that Europeans are like, we don't want daddy to leave. I really think that. Like, meaning, it is not a contradiction to say that the US is passing this off to Europe and the US is pushing Europe to increase the amount of money that it's spending. And that the Europeans were told this, but they don't want daddy to go. They don't think, like, let me ask you this. Do you really believe that Europe could carry this burden? Like, yeah, obviously the United States can't. This was kind of exposed during the war with the 12-day war in Israel, while also trying to have a war in Ukraine. And Israel obviously didn't have the weapons, didn't have the materials, had to basically call it quits within a few days. And so obviously the US can't carry this burden like this on its own across the globe. But is it that Europeans and the leaders, or let's say the European leaders, let's take out the Europeans, the European leaders don't believe that they are in any capacity, any capability at all in order to go and maintain against the Russians? And it's weird because you have this kind of weird dynamic of, if that is true, and it's, we want Europe to be able to do this, then you need Europe to build its own industries, its own military capabilities, its own logistics, its own army. You need that. But that's not what the US does. The US says, buy our weapons. We need you to buy our weapons, which we can't supply to the world. So, like, you're decapitating their ability to fight the Russians, quote unquote, while simultaneously passing off the responsibility of dealing with the Russians. Does that make sense? It seems like a contradiction in the way that the US is operating.
So the way we have to look at this is the people running Europe actually making making the decisions, or I would say implementing the decisions Washington has made. These people work for Washington. They don't care about Europe. I think that's abundantly clear. Look at what they have done to Europe over the last, say, 20, 25 years. They're destroying it. They're emptying it out and destroying it. And they're not attached to Europe. They don't care about Europe. It is about they themselves and their service to Washington and to Western hegemony. That is what they serve, and that's how they see the world. It's exactly like the leadership in Kiev right now. They're not in charge of anything. They obviously don't care about Ukraine, which is why they're running it into the ground. You're absolutely right. Europe cannot do this, and it is going to be a huge diversion of resources from actually sustaining Europe as a place where people actually live, and diverting that to the pursuit of US empire through European resources and manpower. And it's going to accelerate the destruction of Europe even faster than it already is. And they know this. And so this is why they have to kick and scream and pretend they're so upset about this, because it's going to be a tough pill for everyone to swallow. And they have to make it look like this was forced upon them. And this isn't something that they find acceptable, even though they obviously do. If these people in Europe actually cared about Europe, they would never have gotten involved in this war in the first place. Do you remember before 2014, Europe and Russia were so close and expanding the relationship, and Europe and China were actually beginning to work closer and closer together. And there was this, like, for a very brief moment, this ray of hope that Europe would finally, after decades, work their way out from under US hegemony. But then the US overthrew Ukraine. They consolidated political control over all of Europe. And they pushed everything into this direction. They made sure that, no, Europe is not getting out from under US hegemony. They're going to stay under it. And if we have to pick between US hegemony and Europe's peace, stability, even its existence, we pick American hegemony. And that's what we're watching manifest right now.
But I don't. Okay. You have leaders like this, who my ex told me was a Mensa person, who I was like, you're out of your mind. This pretty dumb woman says stuff like this.
China is so much bigger economy than Russia is, with so much bigger military than Russia is. So if you're saying that you're not able to beat, that we collectively are not able to really pressure Russia so much that it would have an effect, because then how do you say that you're able to take on China?
She is sitting there postulating, hey, I know we just lost this war in Ukraine, but it's so much bigger than Russia, and it's so much bigger than this. And if you're saying that is their leadership, she is postulating a war with China while losing a war with Russia. That is their thinking. Do you really think that woman, do you really think that woman is a robot? Or do you really think that woman is just dumb? And I can say the same thing about Starmer, Rutte, all of these people, the parade of morons that are coming behind Zelensky. All of those people are out there, basically saying, don't give up the war, Trump, daddy, don't leave. It doesn't seem like they are lying. It seems like they really don't want daddy to leave.
Well, okay, I will concede this. There are people there who are, you know what I mean? You get someone, you can pick two types of people to perform this role. Someone who understands it, and they realize, well, we have to sell this to the people, or they're going to string us up from the lampposts. Or you could have someone like that who is a true believer, and just by default, just because they are so ignorant and clueless and rudderless, and that's why you pick them in the first place, they'll go along with it, and they will kick and scream, and they will perform exactly as you would want them to, without even having to tell them. And I see examples of that here in Southeast Asia. When the US is building up an opposition, they have a wide variety of people across an entire spectrum, where some of them know absolutely that they are destroying their own country and they don't care. They're serving themselves, and they're able to put on an act as if they don't understand that, and that this is really for everyone's best interest. But they also have true believers who will just go through the song and dance exactly as the US wants them to, because they actually believe in it. And, we hear a lot about the US, Soros, the NED funding mobs. The vast majority of the people in these mobs are not paid to be there. They show up because they have been convinced by the US, by its information game, to believe in this. And so I think there's a mixture of it. I don't think we can say all of them, but for all intents and purposes, they're doing this. They have to do this because they know that it's going to destroy Europe. They know this, and they cannot act as if this was a voluntary decision they wanted to make. They have to pose as if this was forced on them. But as you made a very good point there. There are people who are going to see this unfold, and that will be the default conclusion they themselves draw, that the US is leaving and they're dumping this on us, and that's horrible. Because they believe their own propaganda. So I think there's a mixture of it. I think some of them are well aware of what's going on, and they're just lying about it. Others are just so delusional that they have been manipulated, and it's manifesting just as the US wants it to sell this narrative, this division of labor and strategic sequencing that they themselves have been openly planning and implementing step by step up until now.
That video is funny. It's so funny to me. That video is so funny to me. She seems so confused. She's like, how are you going to say we're going to go after Russia if we can't go after China? I mean, China's so much bigger than Russia. And it's like, yeah. What is the confusion, right? China is a massive economy, and you're losing to Russia, and you're like, but we got to go after China. Why do you have to go after China? It's such a weird video. How does
Yes.
Russia prevent this from being Minsk 3?
Well, that's another good question. We have been at this juncture several times over the past 8 months or so. Just since President Trump, his administration came into power, there were many junctures where the U.S. was piling up pressure on Russia to agree to some sort of ceasefire. And we keep saying that if Russia agrees to it, it will be Minsk 3 for sure. But they haven't agreed to it. They haven't made any concessions at all yet. And even though there's a lot of rumors floating around about what concessions may or may not have been made at this meeting in Alaska, still haven't seen anything concrete emerge. So far, Russia is ignoring this. They're winning on the battlefield. And if they don't want this to become Minsk 3, they need to continue fighting on the battlefield. And there's many ways this can all unfold. They can agree on something and then cite some sort of violation and then continue fighting. They can wait to see if how the U.S. is going to play this game. Are they going to tell the Europeans and the Ukrainians to stop, and then they're going to say no, and then just send in their peacekeeping force, which is just to freeze the conflict? Are they going to do that? And then what will Russia do in response to that? There's many things that they can do. And so we just have to wait and see. I don't think there's any point in predicting. We'll just look at the many different options that can take place. But overall, if they do not want this to become Minsk 3, they need to just keep fighting on the battlefield. They need to just keep going. The front line is collapsing. Wouldn't make any sense at all to make concessions or any sort of agreements with agreement-incapable adversaries. The U.S. wants to destroy Russia. That has not changed. And they have a history of only breaking all of their agreements. There's no example where you can say, that's exactly the one instance the U.S. kept their word. They never have, and they certainly can't under the Trump administration. President Trump was already president for 4 years. And all throughout those 4 years, he made and broke promises, and he perpetuated and provoked and precipitated all of this that we see unfolding right now, alongside President Obama and President Biden.
If the Europeans invade Ukraine, they would kill them all. They would have to. I could be wrong. They would have to.
Yeah, it's hard to
it's
tell.
Under the camel's tent, right? I mean, look, that sounds brutal. But if you don't, then what? It's that part. If you don't, then 5,000 becomes 20,000. A, they show that Putin is bluffing. And B, they're able to effectively invade part of Ukraine, which effectively makes it part of NATO. The entire point of the war was to prevent NATO from expanding into Ukraine. I don't know of another way around it. I mean, I could be wrong. I know that sounds brutal, but 1.5 million Ukrainians are dead. 100,000, 150,000 Russians are dead. Like, all of this is brutal, right? I agree with you. See, Mark said something to me one day where he says, look, I know people in the West think Putin is this fire breather. He said, but all things being equal, Putin is a diplomat and a moderate. And the thing that freaks him out about Putin is always willing to make a deal. From my point of view, Russian demands or demands of leaders, especially politicians, tend to be maximalist, even if they sound rational. And there's usually some gray area in that demand that they can effectively use in order to come to some kind of deal or agreement. I would hope, God, man, I deeply, deeply hope, and if I am wrong in this hope, that will be the last day I do this channel, that they are not dumb enough to end up in a Minsk 3. I just can't conceive, after Minsk 1 and 2, after the Istanbul agreements, after we won't move an inch to the east, after all of this, that they still say, these people are people we can negotiate with. I don't see it. I mean, do you get that sense? Especially when I'm listening to Dmitry Medvedev, who I think is the honest voice. I think that is the point of view of Russia. Whatever Putin says, Medvedev is the guy who gives the honest point of view. I don't get the sense that Medvedev is like, yeah, let's make a deal with these people. I don't get the sense that they will fall back into a Minsk 3. But give me your take on this. I mean, do you think they are in a mindset to be deluded, even if they do come to some agreement?
Oh, I agree with you, and I agree with what Mark said, and that is my worry too, is that there might be some sort of agreement. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've talked to people in governments around the world where they come and they ask me, what my opinion is on something, and I explain to them what the US is actually doing, and they have a very hard time accepting that. And they also have a very hard time accepting the reality that you cannot reason with them. They don't care about you. They don't want to make a deal with you. There's no place at their table for you. So you need to protect yourself from these people. You cannot reason with them. There is no deal that you can make with them that will ever be for sure kept. And so you have to face that reality. A lot of these people are utterly enamored with the West. And I'm not saying that this is the case with President Putin. I'm saying it's a possibility because I've met people like this. They have studied in the West. They have family that has studied or is currently studying the West. They like to travel to the West. And just the threat of that being taken away from them, when you see the US threaten to take away visas and people are like, so what, who cares? To these people, they care. They care deeply, and that is enough to keep them in line. And they know in the back of their mind that the US is incrementally cutting away their country out from under them. They know that, but they're not willing to make the short-term sacrifices and risks necessary to fully protect their country and stop this. And over time, it just keeps getting cut out from under them until one day they wake up and it's gone. It's not there anymore. And we've talked about this in the past. Bangladesh, the government there knew this was happening, but they continued to ignore it. They didn't want to take the steps necessary to confront what the US was doing to their country. And one day, Prime Minister woke up one day and she was on a helicopter flying to India because the US succeeded in hollowing out and collapsing her government. And that is what the US is doing still to this day all around the globe. People think the NED is gone. Nobody talks about it. Their website is still up. They still have a list of countries a mile long that they're interfering in. They have all the programs up there, although they're very vague, and they admit that they're not going to disclose who exactly they're funding, but it still all continues. So this is my fear. And this is something that you and we both hope does not happen, because that would be a true sad day for multipolarism. And if that is the mindset of the people who make up multipolarism, then multipolarism doesn't have a future. They don't have a future because they're not actually trying to displace the Western system. They're trying to impress it and be accepted by it. It's just like in high school. You do, kids, you either fit in with the in crowd or you don't. And you have to either accept that or you don't. And then the people who don't put themselves through a daily routine of humiliation by trying to fit in and being constantly rejected and pretending to themselves maybe that someday they have a chance. And in a lot of ways, the things we deal with in our daily lives do translate to the geopolitical level. As, I always like to compare the United States to a global mafia. I mean, it's basically the mafia on a global level. So it's all things to keep in mind. I like to look at the worst case scenario. I don't, there's a lot of people out there. Not only do they look at the best case scenario, but they will condemn you for pointing out possible worst case scenarios. It's like, that's not how you plan or do analysis. That's how you wake up every day constantly disappointed when you read the news. So.
Yeah, God, man, I just hope that's not the case. I really hope that's not the case. Like, the idea of losing 100,000, 150,000 people in a war that was provoked, and then after that you still say, yeah, we think we could work with these people. I don't put it beyond Putin to make a deal. I just don't. But God, man, hypervigilance has to be the rule. And I mean hypervigilance in whatever is taking place in regards to that deal. They may look at it. I would imagine that Russia at this point is not looking at any deal as being permanent. Any deal they make is probably a breather. What they know the next iteration is coming. I mean, for God's sake, while Donald Trump is negotiating in Alaska, they're making deals with Armenia and Azerbaijan with military exercises in the underbelly of Russia. Russia's blowing up oil pipelines from Azerbaijan as we speak, locking up these Azeris in their country that's part of the mob with Azerbaijan, being more, let's say, aggressive in some of the actions that they've taken. I mean, some of the attacks that took place in Russia most likely came out of Azerbaijan, just like the attacks in Iran. So agreed. I just hope they don't F this up. did you have an expectation that they were going to be able to come to some agreement? Like, what do you think he is telling Zelensky now? I mean, I showed the video of Zelensky and Trump at the White House. That was a completely accurate video, by the way. I showed them there. What do you think that conversation is like? Because Zelensky is still saying, and by the way, this could be a poison pill from the standpoint of either Trump or Russia. We want to get out of this. Like you said, diversification of labor. We don't want to be a part of it anyway. We're giving something to the Europeans that we know they're going to reject so I can walk, meaning he always has the ability to walk. What is this conversation with Zelensky?
Well, this is the role you're going to play for this episode of US Does Geopolitics, and this is what you need to say and do, and don't mess it up. Don't mess up your lines, because that's what the last meeting was, where President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance were teaming up on President Zelensky. That was all theater, and you watched people, not just the general public, but people who are otherwise grounded analysts completely fall for it. It was all theater. There is no base of power that President Zelensky has. He has no basis of power to make this. People think, oh, he won the election, so he's the president, and then he just says something and people will go and do it. That's not how the real world works. Money and guns. That's who controls things. Who in Ukraine has money and guns? President Zelensky doesn't. Who does? The US. Department of Defense runs the military, and the CIA runs the intelligence agencies. So what power does President Zelensky himself have? Zero. He has zero power. So he's not making decisions. He has no ability to make decisions. He could say whatever he wants, and then the actual establishment in Ukraine created by the US from 2014 onward will just do the opposite. You remember that video where President Zelensky went to the front lines and these Nazis essentially were saying, we don't care who you are or what you say. And they were all carrying guns, and he was just standing there.
President of this country. How dare
he was just standing there blank faced while they all had a bunch of guns and could have murdered him and his entourage right then and there if they wanted to. And this is the reality of power that people just seem not to be able to grasp. They watch too many movies, and that is how their perception of American politics is. Ooh, they won the election, they're in power, they're making decisions. And they never look into the actual deep state, the corporations and financial institutions that actually control all of the money and all of the guns. And which is why no matter who you vote for, nothing changes, because they're the ones that hold all the power. They don't care what the American people think every 4 to 8 years. They put two people up for election that either way, that's their candidate, because they both will answer to them, those interests, not the American people. So that's how this meeting will go.
I agree with you and I disagree with you. I agree with you with the lawyers, guns, and money stuff. You have my full agreement on that, right? Like, I don't care how smart you are. I can always hit you in the nose, right? It's like, give me your wallet. It doesn't matter your IQ. Force, at the end of the day, is, or better yet, leverage. Leverage. I'll go with leverage. And the reason I'll go with leverage as opposed to force, because there's all sorts of things. Have you ever watched, what is that superhero thing called? The Boys. Have you ever watched The Boys?
I've seen like maybe the first season a long time ago.
There's one of the characters in the CEO. He's the CEO of a company. There's Homelander, which is kind of like Superman, but he's a lunatic. He's nuts. He loves breast milk and stuff like that.
Anti-Superman.
Yeah, he's an anti-Superman. He loves breast milk. He has a mental issue because he had no family when he was growing up. He was just growing up in a lab, and it has deep emotional scars. So think of Superman with deep emotional scars, and loves adulation and attention. All right. Stan owns the company. He's CEO of the company. Stan is just the man. He has no fear of Homelander at all. Homelander would threaten. He would come in the room. Stan would give him these kind of brutal lessons, going after his ego and everything else. And then he'd be like, all right, you can leave my office now. And Homelander would gripe, angry, and leave and go kill somebody. Why could Stan do that? Stan could do that because Stan had leverage. Zelensky fully believes that he has leverage. Like, meaning in his mind, you're absolutely right. Zelensky is, Donald Trump could tell a random Azov soldier, I give you $100,000 if you take his life. and Zelensky's life will be taken. So agree. You have my agreement with that. But it doesn't matter. But that doesn't change what's in a person's mind. And in his mind, it's, I can scream this to the public. I can scream this to the European leaders. I can scream this to somebody, in which case they will back me in this process. He did this on Twitter, by the way. When Trump says, I summon you to my office, or do you come to my office? Time that you get your, next part. And he goes on Twitter saying, people need to rebel. People need to rise up. And most of the people who were putting out was like, we need to string you up. We need to take your life, in which case he deleted the tweet. He believes it. He's a true believer in the sense that I'm the president of this country. I think I can marshal the Europeans to back me up. See, look at them. I'm shaking their hands. They're giving me hugs. They're patting me on the back. They're all coming to, a carnival of idiots and morons to DC with me in order to back me up so Trump doesn't bully me. He believes it. He's a true believer. That's what I mean. From his point of view, power is not just the guns. Power is public support that he doesn't have. He's delusional, but within the context of that delusion, I'm saying people go rogue when they believe something that is not indicative of reality, which is why I said Zelensky doesn't matter, but Zelensky doesn't seem to know that. Give me your take on that.
No, it's possible. It kind of goes back to what we were saying about people.
Yeah.
The U.S. put these people into place. Some of them fully understand the script and they're acting along, and some people fully believe in it. Either way, what we see, the outcome is still the exact same outcome the U.S. wants. So if the U.S. wants Zelensky to come to Washington and throw a fit, they're going to assess his psychological state. Everyone around him, the U.S. controls, and so they could be like, do you hear him talking to himself in his bathroom or something? And we'll use that. We can use that. And, things could happen that are unpredictable. And, the U.S. has a long history of creating proxies. And then just as you say, them going delusional, thinking they actually do have power. And the U.S. being like, well, this guy has outlived his usefulness. Let's, someone in, like you say, will assassinate him that way, or we'll just do like what the U.S. did to Saddam Hussein, who had been working as U.S. proxy and then was literally strung up by the United States after they invaded and took over Iraq. And so there's all of these possibilities. So, I say these things at the end of the day, it really is the outcome, the mechanics of it, because Zelensky is literally an actor. And so is President Trump, by the way. They're both literal actors who have, for many, many years of their lives, performed for the public. It's very hard to tell where that line starts and stops between play acting and self-delusion, and how the actual interests with the actual power, how they're either scripting it or simply exploiting it. At the end of the day, I think it's still going to be the same outcome.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you on the outcome. Because, again, a proxy with... Yeah, he's a proxy. And whether he believes he has power or not is irrelevant to the point. He's being summoned here for his next role. So I'm still a firm believer that he played the piano with his penis. I don't want to give that up. I just can't. I can't wake up in the morning if I don't believe.
That's what people have to remind themselves of about Zelensky, that he was literally a clown. That was his job, was being a clown. And now he's president of Ukraine and he has agency. Come on.
Not so much. Yeah, not so much. Well, one last point on this. From the European leaders, all of these people are coming here. The U.S. is trying to hand this over to Europe. At least that's what it seems like. It's like, look, we're done with this. You can buy weapons from us. You can do that. We're okay with that. But we have other things to do. There's some people who believe that this is the U.S.'s way of trying to, and you're also right, we haven't seen the deal. Very true. The U.S. and Europe have a tendency to talk to itself, whereas Russia's usually more, reticent to expose stuff until stuff is concluded. Totally right. So we don't exactly know what that deal is. I would imagine no expansion of NATO, meaning I don't think Russia gave up its core aims. So there's that. Is it possible this is a poison pill in order to... Let's see, I don't think the U.S. wants a collapse on the battlefield. Like in every situation, like when Minsk came up, the first time around, the first 2 times around, it came up in a situation exactly like this. There was going to be something catastrophic. There were all these threats. When it was clear the threats wouldn't work, it's like, okay, let's negotiate. Meaning we don't want the worst outcome to take place, so we're willing to negotiate the safe face. So Trump could say, hey, I got a deal. I did what I said I was going to do, blah, 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 blah. That's my issue with it being a fake deal, but I guess we have to see what the deal is. I don't know what the deal is. Is this a pivot to Iran by chance? Iran seems to believe that war is imminent, and some reporters have come out that war is imminent, and that part of the reason that Donald Trump is effectively trying to conclude one war is so he can effectively start another.
Exactly. This is why they got out of Afghanistan, not because they were done with empire, but because they don't have enough resources to do Afghanistan and all of these other things that they had planned. They were working on Ukraine even then, back then, and they were saying to themselves, we just simply don't have the resources. Russia, China, Iran. Okay, you could say, well, they're in Afghanistan and they're bordering Iran, but how practical was that? Were they going to go from Afghanistan and invade into Iran? So yeah. Iran is on the table. That is something they openly aspire to do. When we say the U.S. wants to pivot from Russia to China, it does not mean that they're not going to do everything in between. Just like we were saying, right now the U.S. is in Azerbaijan and Armenia creating problems. They're interfering in scores of countries all around the world attempting regime change. They were just precipitating a border war here between Thailand and Cambodia. So they're everywhere, creating havoc absolutely everywhere. So yes, Iran is definitely on the list. They always have been. They know that. The U.S. right now is trying to disarm Hezbollah, compel Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah to further isolate Iran so that they can deliver the death blow. So that is still, you're right, that's still absolutely on the table. The thing we have to look at regarding the U.S. and Ukraine is there's many things they can do. They can call in Europe, and Europe can pretend like they're going to stomp their feet and say no, and then the U.S. can just dump it on them, and they can go and they can continue. Or the U.S. can tell Europe, hey, let's all agree to this thing with Russia, and then a month or two from now, just completely violate it, like they've violated every other agreement they've ever made. There are so many ways this can manifest itself where the U.S. still gets what it has openly said it wants: a division of labor and strategic sequencing. That is their plan. This is what they've been planning for years. This is the only thing they're actually preparing to do. They're not actually preparing to do anything else except for this. So that's the only outcome. How we go from here to there, that's the question, and that only time will tell. So we have to just keep an eye out and watch it.
I need to see the security guarantees. That's the part that freaks me out. Oh, that freaks me out. Because the moment that you have some kind of security guarantees where you have, let's say, if Europe is involved in security guarantees, there's nothing to stop a provocation that, let's say, one side does something, the U.S. pretends as if it didn't happen. When Russia responds, that all of a sudden everybody's at war. Oh, look, man, that is the worst case scenario. Agreed. The Lebanon thing is interesting because I don't think that the U.S. fully believed that Hezbollah was ever going to give up its weapons. I think it's about chaos, that we're trying to embroil this country into a civil war. I don't think that's going to, everybody that I've talked to from Lebanon don't think that's going to happen, though. They think there's a better chance for the Lebanese government to be overthrown as opposed to there actually ends up in a civil war between Hezbollah and the Lebanese army. But who knows? You're right, they're into everything. And Iran is definitely on the table. One of my audience members, she said, Jamal, ask Brian if he's read policies on how the U.S. is handling, I think this is Aborigines, U.S. Americans. Maybe I'm pronouncing this wrong. It's not Aborigines.
I saw it on the screen, but I wasn't able to read it because I was in
right there.
thought. U.S. Americans. Well, I mean, if you're talking about the indigenous population of America, which has all been exterminated. I mean, that was their policy: exterminate them, and that's for all intents and purposes. There's just some remnants, like you see, like a extremely endangered species in the wilds like once every 10 years or something. I mean, that's what they did. People don't know. A lot of Americans don't know their own history. Hawaii used to be an independent kingdom. It had a monarchy. In the U.S.
Yes.
Had all these Americans go over there, and then it's like over 100 years ago, and they did the exact same thing, like an NED color revolution. Had all these Americans who had been living there, they all came into a group, they all got guns, they overthrew the government and the monarchy, and they forced them to sign a new constitution. The U.S., not the government, the special interests in the U.S., the fruit companies and sugar companies that wanted to exploit the island's natural resources, they drew up this contract, and they had the United States military marshaled by the government on their behalf, because even back then, corporations controlled everything in the United States, and they subjugated Hawaii, and they colonized it, essentially. They stole it from the people who were already living there for generations, and just built on top of them. And if you look at Hawaii even today, there's still kind of a small independence movement, not very practical, but you understand why they're upset. And it's just a reminder of how the U.S. actually does business versus how they portray they do business. And if that's what they meant, I mean, this is no secret. The U.S. has been very open about Native Americans, exterminate them all, take everything they have and leave them with nothing. And if they complain, take more. That is their policy.
Do you think this global primacy game, this quote unquote game, is going to ultimately work?
No, I mean, we can
that's
see
a big question, but I'm just.
Yeah, I mean, multipolarism is on the rise. The U.S. empire is in decline. But people have to be very careful not to underestimate the U.S. A lot of people just pretend, oh, they're losing in Ukraine, the empire is over. Could you imagine back in the middle of the Vietnam War, and then you saw it end, and you said, American empire is collapsing? No, it's still here. 50 years later, it's still here. It's just as dangerous. It is still destroying entire nations. Millions of people are still dying because of the United States right now, 50 years, a half century after the end of the Vietnam War. Empires have ups and downs. And this is why I always warn about confirmation bias. You sit there and you collect all of America's most recent defeats, and you only focus on that, and you ignore that they just completely toppled Syria. They took it from Russia and Iran right out from under them. So no, the empire is not going to collapse today or tomorrow. It is extremely dangerous. Underestimating it will be a fatal mistake. We don't know how long this will take, which is why we all have to fully invest in this and see this through to the end, and not engage in wishful thinking that will cause us to I don't know, be complacent. And then complacency is exactly what the U.S. thrives on, people not taking the threat seriously and then being able to organize themselves and mow over you.
It just doesn't seem like the sequencing thing is taking place from the standpoint of the U.S. I mean, they were embroiled, or we were embroiled into multiple conflicts at once, while simultaneously trying to have a conflict with China. I mean, the idea that you go, for example, Israel goes to war with Iran at the exact same time that Ukraine and Russia are still fighting a conflict that is backed and pushed by the U.S. South Korea, at the exact same time, Yoon Suk-yeol tries to declare martial law out of the blue on like a Tuesday, and effectively tries to take over that country in order to provoke a war with North Korea, which was apparently part of the plan, to pretend as if North Korea had kidnapped various members of the South Korean political class, even though they were going to kill their own political class in order to frame North Korea to do it, effectively provoking another war. That's not sequencing. That's mania. That's something else. Oh, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Give me a take on it.
No, I mean, empire is insane. Empire is unsustainable. It is something that comes from a sick mindset, a supremacist mindset. No, I'm pretty sure, Jamal, you're the one who always says that racist people cannot see the world clearly. And they are
Right.
the most racist people in the history of the human race. I mean, it's not a coincidence that when Nazi Germany fell, they just gathered up the absolute worst Nazis that weren't hung publicly, and then had them running programs in the U.S. government. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that they're still literally backing Nazis in Ukraine. And if you look at what Zionism is, it is extremist and it is racist. And so this is the U.S. seems to have a habit of supporting the absolute worst elements in all of these countries and regions that it targets. And they cannot see the world clearly. They honestly believe that they are inherently superior to everyone on earth. And they look at China, especially a non-white nation, and they believe they are inherently, genetically, intellectually, culturally superior, politically superior, militarily superior to the Chinese, when all reality says otherwise. The Roman Empire did the exact same thing. And the British Empire after that did the exact same thing. So it is a sick mind. Yes, you accumulate huge amounts of power and there is huge momentum behind it, but ultimately it's unsustainable. How and when it collapses, that's the question. But that is what the rest of the world who wants to live in peace and prosperity need to think
I guess
about.
I'm trying to point out that's not sequencing though. Like what Russia's doing seems to be sequencing. Okay, we're going to deal with Ukraine. And then we're going to deal with Azerbaijan, meaning they seem to be focusing very specifically on one thing and then moving to something else. Because I would wager to you, going after the Azerbaijani oil, going after the gangs, going after these elements. And they're doing it in a very subversive way. It's kind of like, hey, we don't want to mess up our relationship with Azerbaijan. These are former Soviet republics. We don't like their unfriendly actions towards us, but we want to keep diplomatic relations. Bam, blows up oil field. We're going to grab that guy. We're going to throw these people in prison. We're going to do this. Meaning they're doing all of this stuff using, let's say, the battleground of Ukraine as being kind of an open ground to do it without it being overt to Azerbaijan itself, while keeping up a facade that they know is not real. That we're still brotherly countries. Like that seems like sequencing. That's them. We're dealing with one issue, which is Ukraine. We're trying to put this to bed at the very least for a few years. And we're now going to have to deal with the other issues that the United States is bringing up, either with Iran or for that matter, with the Caucasus. The US doesn't seem to be doing that though. I see now that they're giving over Ukraine, but up to this point, it doesn't seem like that's what they were doing in regards to sequencing. Are they just bad at it?
Well, the U.S. is a global empire, and it's going to be busy at work globally. But you have to look at the vector sum of where their focus is. And for the last couple of years, it has been Russia primarily, not just Ukraine. They've been operating along a number of fronts. The Extending Russia paper has a whole list of pressure points, and the U.S. has implemented every single one of them, at least once, some of them more times than one. Now they are pivoting toward China, and this has been taking place over years. We remember under the Obama administration the pivot to Asia, and so they have been slowly pivoting away from Middle East, Eastern Europe, over to that direction. I think they thought that they could, and to a degree they have succeeded in weakening Russia first before going over to China. I don't know why they did that. They thought that they could do this. To a certain degree, they have weakened Russia. Again, I would just point out that they took Syria out from under Russia and Iran. So now they are openly, obviously pivoting towards China. That is a form of sequencing. That doesn't mean they're not going to still be still completely involved in everything. They always have been. I mean, that's what makes it an empire. That's what makes it so wrong, is because they are involved in everyone else's business, except taking care of their own business back at home.
On the China thing, I got to be honest, I am deeply confused at how they believe they can win that. I mean, the whole blocking off ports, blocking off shipping, creating some kind of conflict where they can go after shipping, I get that part. China seems to be expanding overland in order to try to avoid it because, again, the moment that you write a policy paper, Chinese people have people who can read English, who can read their policy papers, which is always wild to me, right? It's like, I have this great idea. This is how we're going to screw with China. And let me write this down. They would never know. That's always fascinating to me. And of course, China, Russia, all these countries have their own war planners, and they're also thinking about, okay, what are these other countries trying to do, and what do we do in order to deal with it? Inevitably, that ends in war. Inevitably. And I get that the U.S. wants to be, well, we want proxies to do this. We want to be able to stay in the background, kind of like we did Ukraine. It's not going to end up there. And I guess it's somewhat of a basic question. Why do they think that's going to work? What's the thinking in that, in regards to, this is the global geopolitical strategy where we think that ultimately we can win this against China? Because I don't see that.
Well, ultimately, it might not work. And I mean, China is on a trajectory where it is going to, and in many ways already has surpassed the entire West. The problem is, I mean, we can look at different junctures in history where this has been taking place, where, you know, if you look at the headlines and the mindset of people during the Cold War, the Soviet Union seemed to be ascending and surpassing the West, even though it really wasn't. China really is now. So that is the difference. But there were people in the mindset that was going to happen, and that it was inevitable, and it wasn't inevitable. And the U.S. ultimately prevailed. That woman, I don't know who that lady is, because honestly, all of these EU officials, I don't pay attention to who any of them are. Okay, yes, all right, yeah, that does seem to fit her.
I love her to death. She trips me out. Well, we're gonna be China if we can't be Russia. Yeah, her.
But to her point, the U.S. lost in Vietnam, and yet they still buried the Soviet Union. So people have, like I said, people have to be very careful. Just because they're getting out of Ukraine does not mean anything. You have to get out. I always have these, like a physical notebook, get a clean sheet of paper out and draw a line down the middle and tally it up on both sides. And don't be afraid to look at the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. People have the tendency to just look at their strengths and the other's weaknesses, and that is how they tally everything up. That's insane. You're always going to be wrong if that's what you do. You have to be honest about the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, tally it up, and look at how it really adds up. And unfortunately for the United States, they still have tremendous power. I always bring up political meddling, their ability to politically capture an entire country. Russia and China still have no real answer for this. Russia, to a degree, has been pushing back a little bit better. People forget, before the special military operation started in 2022, Russia sent troops to, I think it's Kazakhstan, because the U.S. had a violent uprising. They were trying to overthrow and politically capture the entire country. And Russia said, nope, we don't care how it looks. We're sending troops in to stabilize. And they did. They did the same thing to Belarus. That was on the list of extending Russia, overthrow the government of Belarus. And so Russia stopped that. Seems that U.S. regime change has been set back in Georgia. I probably chalk that up to Russia being involved somehow. China needs to start doing this here in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. has tremendous political control over countries through this process that there really is no resistance to at the moment. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how enticing, a real enticing deal your Belt and Road Initiative is, or anything else you have to offer. The U.S. only has to install a client regime to say no, and to convince their people no, because they control the information space. And then the answer is no, even if it makes no logical sense at all. And even if it means that country is committing collective suicide, like Ukraine is doing right now. That is the power of politically capturing a country. You short circuit the competition. You rig the competition in your favor. And so the multipolar world needs to get wise to that and get on top of that. Because, like I said, you can have all the military power in the world. If you cannot convince the people in a country to utilize that military power in their defense, then it means nothing. And this is the realization that Western Empire came to 2,000 years ago. They understood this, and they have been doing it ever since. And people need to get wise to this and counter it collectively.
Argentina is a really good example. If you remember, they were supposed to be part of BRICS.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I think Malay gets in, and they're like, "Yeah, no, we're not doing it." It's like, dude, this is not in your best interest. I don't care. Just short circuit the entire process. Well, Golden Dome, is it a boondoggle, or would it start a Third World War?
Well, it's a little bit of both. Why can't it be both? It could be both.
It could be both. Well, if it's a boondoggle, then you don't have to worry about it. Meaning, if it's Like, for example, the Star Wars project, where Reagan is like, we're going to have lasers in space. If the Soviets believed it, and they're like, okay, we have to do something about that. As opposed to, those people are idiots, and this is purely a waste of money. We don't believe that they're going to do it. If they believe it, look, the moment that you put something in space, all bets are off. Countries can't allow it, which forces behavior, once again. Like rods from God. Do you remember that one? Where it's like, we're going to have rods, and they're going to just be flying in space, and we can drop them anywhere around the globe at any particular moment they hit any country.
They could have them. They could have them up. I mean, I was listening to experts in the aerospace industry say that not only could the U.S. easily secretly send them up under the guise of a commercial satellite, Russia and China could also have systems like that up in space already. And I mean, that's the thing, though. If you just say it and it seems like there's sufficient energy and resources behind it, the other side, whether they think you're going to follow through or not, they need to start planning. Because the moment something goes up into space, if you haven't been planning and preparing all along, you're 5 to 10 years behind. It's just like the West saying, we want to expand military industrial production. Well, that takes like 10, 20, 30 years, depending on how atrophied your industry actually is. And the same goes for Russia, China, and everyone else responding to the U.S. and the Golden Dome system, which can manifest itself in many ways. They say they're going to put things up into space. They're also going to have ground-based systems.
Right.
So essentially what you're saying is we're going to try to make it so that if we shoot a nuclear weapon at Russia, they can't shoot any back at us, which was the whole point of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, an arms control treaty that I think in a lot of ways did deter a nuclear exchange. The U.S. is trying to tip the balance in its favor in a nuclear exchange. And that fits the psychosis that we see manifesting itself across U.S. special interests. They understand they're losing hegemony, and they're willing to do worse and worse things to hold on to it. And there's nuclear weapons. This is a tremendous power, and they're exploring the different ways they could use that. Again, as with everything else, with impunity. That's where Golden Dome comes in.
Oh, that's a good point. That's such a good point. I'm glad you made that point. That's such a good point. It's like, all right, we need to figure out how to win a nuclear war. And I guess that goes to the first question that I was asked about China. How do they plan to win this? Ultimately, you're going to end up in an exchange if you keep pushing in this direction. At some point, China is going to have to respond. And if you get into this kind of conflict back and forth, the moment that one person introduces tactical nukes, then you're in a nuclear war. If you have the capability of being able to try to defend your homeland in a nuclear war, then you may have a better chance of surviving that nuclear war. That's a hell of a gamble. Oh, that is a hell of a gamble. That is a hell of a gamble. We've seen the air defense systems in Israel, but that shit doesn't work. It just doesn't. Or I mean, let me say, it doesn't work well.
It does, but it does, and it doesn't, and that's the problem. But you have to look at the calculus on both sides, because Israel has a missile defense system, and because the U.S. augmented it with THAAD, Iran needed to launch so many more missiles. And it becomes incumbent upon Iran to vastly expand its ability, not just to make missiles, but to launch them simultaneously, because that's the only way you can saturate and overwhelm a missile defense system, is by firing many of them at one time. And we saw, because Israel and the US were bombing Iran in the middle of this conflict, their air defense system obviously wasn't operating or didn't exist, whatever the case may be. They were not able to send very large volleys, and people were coping. They were saying, well, the missile defense system is depleted, so they don't need to send as many. If you can launch 100 in the beginning of the conflict and only 10 get through, and now that you've depleted their missile defense system, why not just shoot 100 missiles and hit 100 targets? Wouldn't that end the war quicker? So there's a lot of cope. It's not just for the pro-Ukrainian side. Cope is for everybody. Everybody is tempted to dip into it and indulge, and we have to resist doing that. When weakness is apparent, you have to accept it and you have to deal with it. You have to figure out how you're going to overcome it. Ignoring it is not going to make it go away.
Or strike first. I mean, look, at the point where it became very clear that Israel, and I get it, right? Countries have this thing of, well, we want to be moral. We want to be just. We want to have a moral war in the way that we fight it, as opposed to we need to win it, because this is about survival. This is about maintaining your state. They're trying to take you down. Act accordingly. No, I agree with you. The Iran thing was weird to me. From my understanding, a lot of that stuff had to do with these kind of this new method of warfare, where they would, let's say, drive in a truck, then drones will come out of the truck and destroy various elements. You have Mossad agents, you have all of these people who you effectively paid off to either destroy air systems and everything else, in decapitating the capability of the country to respond. And it's like, okay, you want to fight a moral war? Well, they're not trying to fight a moral war. They're just trying to decapitate your country. Yes. Those are very different things. And you need to behave accordingly. But they don't. I have a hypothesis about this, and this could be the last question. Why do you think that's the case? Because some of this is not weakness. Some of this is just an inability or not wanting to accept reality for what it is in their response. Like Russia going into Ukraine. They waited forever to do it, but they did it because they realized between them getting into NATO and them building up this military, this is a better alternative as opposed to them invading us. Iran sat there and allowed themselves to be decapitated. Hell, they almost killed Pezeshkian, who was probably Israel's greatest ally. I know that sounds brutal, but it's true. The reformist government. I think that this has to do with a propaganda campaign that is being run by BRICS countries. And what I mean by this is, in the old days with the Soviet Union, you could say, well, this is these guys are monsters. They're not letting their citizens leave. This is repressive. These days, the argument has changed to naked hegemony versus this other model. This model where we're not going to intrude into your governments. We believe you should have your own elections. You choose who you want, that type of thing. Meaning these two competing ideas of the world where the US is like, we are indispensable, period. We are somehow better than you. And you should fall in line and thank God that we give you breath every morning and every day of your life. Compared to live your life. Have your governments. We just want to trade. We just want to have things. It seems like these are two competing voices in regard to the political spectrum, where the secondary voice of live your life believes that they have a much better political weapon in that voice, whereas the other voice doesn't really care about that argument and just cares about hegemony. We care about winning. Give me your thoughts on that, because whether they're saying that explicitly, that seems to be the argument that's taking place on the global stage. And this could be the last question. I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
I think that's a very good point. I think you've laid it out pretty well, actually. The problem with, and I think that is what BRICS is doing, and you can see that that's what they're doing. The problem with waging information war in the way that they are is, you look at the global information space, the US completely dominates it. It utterly dominates it. So it doesn't matter what your narrative is. Nobody cares, because the US just papers over it like it didn't even exist. That's what they do everywhere. I'm in Southeast Asia, and I watch how the US is able to do this. And why is that? Because all of the countries here, every single one of them, I think maybe Vietnam has a few of their own social media platforms that they have developed indigenously and operate. But everyone else is using Facebook, Meta, whatever it's called these days, X, YouTube. It's all Western and specifically American social media platforms the US controls the algorithms of. And even TikTok, to a large degree, gets coerced and manipulated into falling into line with US information warfare doctrine worldwide. So until BRICS gets serious and says, you cannot fight a war on a battlefield that the other side already completely dominates. You're saying your message over here. You're not even on the battlefield because they won't let you, because they control the algorithm. You're creating alternatives for everything else: financial systems, trading, monetary policy, everything else, but not information space. So again, if the battle is for the human mind, ultimately that's what it is. That's all human civilization is a collection of 7 billion plus minds. The US still has the advantage. They ultimately hold the most important card. And until that gets through the skulls of people in BRICS, this will never change. So like I said, China has a objectively superior deal to offer other nations. But because the US controls information space everywhere except inside China and inside Russia, it doesn't matter. Completely does not matter. So they need to change that. They need to get serious. Information space is a domain of national security and of modern warfare. And if you're not fighting there, it's just like 100 years ago with the invention of the airplane. Everyone else has an air force. You said, it's a newfangled contraption. It's a fad. It'll pass. You're the only one on the battlefield with no air force. That's it. You're done. Right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what it's like. And I don't know why I even have to explain this to them. But I mean, you came to the same conclusion in the question that's what I've been worried about for years now. And I think that really is the crux of the problem. That is the weakness of BRICS. If it does fail, it will be because of that.
Brian Berletic, my man. People have been asking about you, so I'm glad that you could join me, man. Thank you for this. Host, creator of the new Atlas. Check him out. He has a fantastic channel. Obviously, fantastic voice. Thank you for this, Brian. You have a good one, okay?
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, you too.
All right. Brian is fantastic, and we're going to go from one fantastic guest to another. The one, the only Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can find Mark obviously on Twitter, but also on Boosty, Boosty. Check him out at Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, or under the name just Mark Sleboda. How you doing, Mark?
Jamaro, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm alive. How are you?
I am doing okay. I am glad that you could join me. So the Alaska Summit. So it sounds like Trump, Putin has come to some kind of agreement, whatever that agreement is. I don't know what it is. Like normal, Western media is talking to itself about the agreement. The Russians are more circumspect, haven't necessarily mentioned as normal. Zelensky has been summoned to the White House. He is bringing a band of buffoons and morons and degenerates with him, just kind of a circus. Trump pointed out, I'm talking to him first. You idiots, stay in your rooms. Apparently, Zelensky, when asked about this, had a conversation with media, and he said this in response to the Donald Trump call.
To me and I asked President Trump, Mr. President, why did you talk to Russian President Vladimir Putin before talking to me? And President Trump said he wanted to talk to the tallest one first and then the shortest. I was not happy about this. Then I told him that I want to create a European army. And then he asked me if it was an army of short little midgets like me. And I did not like that either. I asked President.
So obviously Zelensky didn't necessarily like the phone call. Axios said it was a tense, complicated phone call. Trump was being very derisive in that call. Zelensky has a point. Give me your point. Give me your take on the Alaska meeting. And obviously that's not. Obviously that's not real, right?
Yeah.
But
so I mean, there is some truth to it because Zelensky is arriving today in Washington with an army of geopolitical midgets, the leaders of Europe, the 7 little dwarves, to defend him, to babysit him and hold him his hands while he meets
animals,
with Trump.
as I call them.
Yeah, so
there
is that. Yeah. So, I mean, when talking about Alaska, at the end of the day, I get really sleepy because I've gorged on so much nothing burger.
Really? Oh, you got to give me that. Okay, you got to give me that. Explain that, because I have a different take on this. But
yeah, I don't think anything happened in Alaska. I think for that we should be grateful. So first of all, Putin wasn't captured or killed, obviously, right? And while that was always an outside possibility, I don't know anyone who wasn't, on the Russian side who wasn't secretly, relieved and pleased when Putin, Trump, and everyone from the delegation touched back down on Russian territory, because logic says that you're dealing with a nuclear superpower and a great power by any stretch of the terms at the very least, and that you don't do things like that. But after the decapitation strikes against Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah, and Trump gloating about his assassination of Soleimani during his first administration, and he re-gloating about that just last week, you can't rely on these people for the normal, bounds of statesmanship and diplomatic behavior.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
Even if I said it myself, it was unlikely, but it's not something that can be discounted completely. Therefore, I was also relieved when Putin touched back down on Russian territory. But there was still a trap created there, right? A pressure trap. From the moment they met on the tarmac and were on a red carpet, and Trump had a B-2 Spirit bomber and F-35s do a low flyby over in some type of macho display that was intended to shake and intimidate or impress Putin. And Putin, of course,
let me interrupt on that. How do you know that was to intimidate as opposed to
what was it for? To showcase the high technological value of the F-35? Come on.
Okay. I'm just saying there are different ways of looking at that. But okay,
was to shake Putin, right? To impress upon him the military might of the United States. That's
and
exactly
you really think Putin was going to look at that and be like, "Oh my God, I'm so terrified."
Someone in the Trump administration did. Maybe Trump himself. I mean, it didn't happen by accident, Jamarl.
No, I'm not saying it happened by accident. I'm saying that the interpretation of it is that this was to intimidate.
Of course it was.
To,
what else would it be there?
Okay.
Celebratory? They could have done that with fireworks if they wanted. Come on.
Fair enough.
It obviously didn't work. It didn't shake Putin in the slightest.
No,
there was a brief attempt at of Trump exerting alpha dog dominance with his usual puerile handshake wrestling going on. And when Putin, who is a several degree black belt judo master, didn't so much as get taken off balance by a man who is considerably taller and has several degrees more mass than him, right? That didn't work either. And then ever after that, it was essentially we were left with what was obviously a bit of a starstruck Trump dealing with someone that at some level he obviously considers his idol for whatever reason that exists. It was like someone's idol lecturing a school child. That's the impression that came across to me. If we're going to go the body analyzing, psychoanalyzing route, which I think is pathetic, but we all engage in it to a certain degree, I guess. Mm-hmm. But it was a big pressure trap, right? I mean, even down to the banner logos, pursuing peace, right? That if Putin didn't agree to Trump's demands to end the war, to save his proxy Kiev regime on Russian terms, then he didn't want peace, right? I mean, that was the implied message there. And Russia didn't blink. They didn't blink to the pressure, right, that was applied to them in any fashion. And so they averted the trap. And if anything, Trump, obviously by the end of the summit, and the summit was obviously a complete failure. At the last minute, the one-on-one meeting was changed for a 3-on-3 meeting. After the 3-on-3 meeting, the 5-on-5 meeting was just dropped off, and we skipped lunch too. And we had a press conference with no questions, where Trump was obviously so deflated, right? He was even somehow convinced, or for whatever reason, it was decided to let Putin speak first, right? and that is unheard of, right? Usually, certainly the host country, and especially the United States, their leader speaks first. But Putin was allowed to speak first, and Putin went on for about 8 minutes and laid out the usual Russian boilerplate, root causes, and all of that, right? And he slathered on a few, face-saving licks to the wounds of Trump there, and Trump, in very deflated, for him, desultory terms, made noises for about 3 minutes, and that was it. And they both left, and there was no lunch, there was no anything else. Everything was cut short. What was supposed to be 7 or 8 hours was truncated down to a fraction of that length, and they went their separate ways. And the only result out of it is that, at least temporarily, Trump is now switched to mouthing Russia's line that, when he demanded a ceasefire and Putin told him no and hell no, and go pound sand, no matter what you do, and we're not scared of your tariffs because we know China and India got our back. Trump is now, all right, well, if we got to end this thing, then it's got to be more on Russian terms. So they've dropped the demands for a ceasefire. Now, it has to be said, all of this has done before. All that was essentially done was Trump was deflated and dialed back like a clock to where he was several months ago. Because at one point previously, after a phone call with Putin, he had dropped the demands for a ceasefire, right? And started talking about a permanent peace plan. And then, of course, he was talked to by his own people, by the people in his administration, by the deep state, by the Europeans, like a slavering horde, and Zelensky. And then Trump was yelling for a ceasefire, and threatening sanctions and everything else. Now we've just had a rewind, and now we're going to go through the whole process again, because Zelensky and that horde of European zombies leaders are going to be in the White House today, browbeating Trump, they will be rolling over and being obsequious, but in a way that demands proper behavior of their master, right? That is what we'll see. So and no matter what, right? Nothing. The Kiev regime and the Europeans won't agree to anything, right, of this, none of this, right? I mean, they've put out their counter proposal, which is like the exact opposite and demanding reparations from Russia, right? So there's a complete impasse, right? Trump does not have the leverage to force Russia to peace on U.S. terms, and he does not have the ability to coerce Kiev and the Europeans and the majority of the government of his own country to make concessions, at least towards Russian terms. So that's it. The war goes on. I mean, that's why I say nothing, Berger. Nothing. We have a temporary change in Trump's rhetoric, but that'll be beat out of him soon enough. And then we'll be back to, toothless sanctions threats and supplying arms through the Europeans, and the war will go on. I don't know any other way really to interpret.
Very rare. It is very rare that I disagree with you, Mark.
Okay.
I cannot disagree with you
so you have gotten wind then, I take it, of the secret 5D agreement that was hashed between Putin and Trump.
No,
and they're both saying nothing about, right? And there's no leaks about, right? But they've both got a secret plan, right, to force the Europeans and the Kiev regime to peace on Russian terms.
No,
right?
That's not what I think. No, just to be clear, that's not what I think. What I think is, I think you've laid it out perfectly up to a point. The fact that Donald Trump, where it was beat out of him, where he's like, all right, only way to make this work is on Russian terms. I think the difference is, and the thing that changed in the context of this is, they are about to lose Donbass in several months. It is humiliating for Trump to have a massive collapse in the way that I think, in his mind, it's taking place. And between having that collapse and coming to terms, even if it's Russian terms, he would rather try to save face and sell it on Russian terms. That's what I think. The European, as you point out, the gang of degenerates, those people are delusional. And they're coming here as a carnival to try to convince Trump of something, regardless of the reality of the things that are taking place on the ground. That is the only difference and the reason why I think this is taking place in the way that it's taking place. I don't think Trump, all things being equal, if they were winning, wouldn't press an advantage. They would. But as you point out, Putin came here. These are my demands. Take it or leave it. Obviously, he wasn't going to push Putin on this. Putin was very clear what he wanted. He had core demands. Trump either accepted or he didn't. And between accepting or allowing failure on the battlefield, when he can't pass secondary sanctions or tariffs on India and China because of the reverberation effects, you have nothing else.
On Italy too. I must say.
I know. Leave Maloney alone. Maloney is okay. I'm not going to say a bad word about Maloney. I like Maloney. Has nothing to do with our policies. But I guess my point is this: he's stuck. He's in a box. What do I do in this situation? How do I escalate against Russia? Well, I can't escalate against Russia. How do I escalate against its neighbors? Well, I can't really do that against India and China because it's going to have reverberation effects back on the US. And yet, I have so much bluster. How do I get out of this? Oh, I know. Let's have a meeting. Oh, we've come to an agreement. Okay, now we're going to bring Zelensky, and I'm going to browbeat Zelensky to accept this agreement as opposed to complete failure. Minsk 1 and 2 was the same way, right? Where you had a Ukrainian collapse that was going to take place. It was going to be humiliating for Europe. Let's come to an agreement. Let's talk to Angela Merkel. We're going to talk, and we're going to come to some kind of deal.
But Putin,
this is not the same. This is not unfolding in a similar fashion. Give me your take, because I could be wrong.
Yeah, Putin has not agreed to Minsk 3, right? I mean, that's obvious.
No,
that was the trap, right? And he didn't.
By the way, which I don't think he will.
Yeah. And what else can Trump do? Trump can't do anything else, right? He can't force his own bipartisan Congress, right? His own deep state, many of the people in his own administration to accept Russian terms. Agreed. He can't. I mean, much less the Europeans and the Kiev regime. He can mouth these words for a while, but he'll be dialed back and brought back under control, brought back onto the reservation. He can't do anything, right? He'll try to fob it off again. Oh, it's not my war. It never would have happened. And Putin, Putin is an absolute expert at playing Trump like a fiddle. Let's be honest about that, right? I mean, everyone tries to manipulate Trump. Trump practically demands that everyone try to manipulate him, right? Whether we're talking foreign leaders, the people in his own administration, everyone, right? Everyone, because that's what he sets up. I am the God Emperor of mankind, and everyone needs to come to my court and pay me court, right? I mean, that's the game. He creates that situation. So everyone, right? As John Bolton admitted within his own administration from the first time, his allies, his enemies, everyone tries to manipulate him. But Putin simply does it better than anyone else. In part, I guess, because Trump at some deep-rooted psychological level has more respect and deference for Putin than anyone else. Maybe because Putin does stand so strong. Well, Mark Rudo, rolls over and shows Trump his belly and still tries to get his way. He doesn't have contempt for them the way, for Putin the way he does for them. I don't want to get into any further, try to get any further into Trump's mind. That's not a winning game for anyone. But that much at least is obvious. But he's just still in a box. He can't agree to Russian terms, right? He can't win the conflict, right? So what's left but to continue, right? He'll try to rebrand things. Again, he won't be giving the Kiev regime arms. The Europeans will just be buying weapons, right? But that still won't change anything because the U.S. doesn't have the type and the quantity of the arms that are necessary. And at this point, no amount of arms would save the Kiev regime with their manpower problem, with their manpower woes. They can continue fighting for a long time in a resistance fashion, I believe, right? It will eventually devolve down into guerrilla war and other things. But that Ukraine's a big country. A military occupation of Ukraine, which is ultimately what Russia is going to be forced to do, is going to take a really long amount of time and a lot of resources for Russia. It's a victory, but only in the sense that it is a less bad outcome than the alternative. It is still a horrible thing for Russia to have to do. For what they have to put into it, what it's going to cost them. That's why, it's an ugly victory. There are no good victories here. There's no, golden path that leads to the utopia outcome. It doesn't exist. So, and Trump can't do anything to stop it, but he also can't stop trying to make it as costly to Russia as possible. He can't get out of that hole. He can't win, but he can't let Putin win, at least not without greater cost either. So and the war continues. That's it. For me, on a personal level, the single best moment of the Alaska summit was the swagger of Mr. Niet himself, Sergei Lavrov, the master of diplomacy, as he walked into the facilities with an SSS Air sweatshirt on. Yeah. And the Western media's just collective jaws just dropped, first in shock and then opened again in outrage, right? And there's even a clip going around, and it might be honest, where it might be real. It's hard to tell these days. Where sitting down with the interpreter for the photo shoot, Putin was asked about it, and someone said to Lavrov right there, "I like your sweatshirt," and it was explained to them through the translator, and Putin just gave a sardonic look at Lavrov, and then turned to the Americans and said, "He's an imperialist." A little joke. That to me, that was. By the way, that sweatshirt is on sale for was on sale for only the equivalent of about $25 on Russia's online outlet Wildberries, which is kind of like Amazon. Yeah. And of course, it's already sold out for months into the future now, right? You cannot get that sweatshirt. They're going to be making Chinese knockoffs of that sweatshirt, right? I don't know where it's actually made. Maybe they don't need Chinese knockoffs, right? But anyway, that to me was, the whole thing is about this entire thing was resulted in practically nothing in long range terms, right? It's a temporary change in rhetoric that is of course going to be reversed because nothing can come out of it, right? So nothing ultimately is going to happen. My big question was, were you entertained? Because that's all you're going to get out of it. Right? Were you entertained? Right? Is that not why you were here, to be entertained? And I was mildly entertained. So I guess in those terms, it was at least only because of Lavrov and a few other choice events, like Russian journalists being forced to live in a third world country.
Yeah, that was so screwed up. That was so screwed up.
Dmitriev finding a bear just outside the facilities and considering that a good symbol, right? Everything, right? The Russians, I think you could definitely chalk them up a tactical victory, right? They didn't succumb to the pressure trap at all. They restated their terms for the upteenth time. They obviously deflated Trump. They didn't bow to his demands, and he was. When have you ever seen him so depressed as he was during that press briefer, right? He was just deflated. It was like someone poked that big orange balloon, and the air was rushing out of it. So that's my take on events. I know there's people out there that believes that some secret plan was agreed to by Trump and Putin. I'm not one of those people. I think it's a lot more simple than that. Russia presented their terms. Trump is in a bad position, so he's at least made a nod toward Russian terms and tries to
Right.
sell that to the Europeans in Kiev, and that will, of course, be, completely rejected. Today that might be happening now, sometime today, and then that's it. The war continues, and
You don't accept that this is a contact. I mean, look at the way Trump is looking at him. Trump doesn't even look at his wife like that.
Yeah, I agree, but ultimately, that doesn't matter. Trump doesn't actually have that much power, right? He's allowed a certain amount of leash, right? He's allowed his say. He'll talk, ceasefire, but he doesn't have that much power. It's the institutions of the U.S. It's a bipartisan congressional consensus. It's the deep state. It's the neocons which is the majority in his own administration.
And
they're all going to. They just have to bring him back onto the ranch.
And you completely discount the capability of Trump saying, "I'm out."
Yes.
Look, you have said yourself that Trump has complete contempt for the gang of morons that have in tow with Zelensky. Has complete contempt for Zelensky himself.
For the Europeans.
For the Europeans, who's probably wanted to walk because he wanted to pivot to Asia. The buzzword for it is this kind of delegation of resources where it's like, look, we've been trying to pivot to Asia going all the way back to Obama, what's this, 20 years, 2016? We haven't been able to do it. We want to division.
Every president gets caught up in the Middle East.
Yes, we want to hand it over to the Europeans and we want to be out. These guys are screaming for daddy. We want out. And as J.D. Vance said, you can buy our weapons, but we don't want any part of this. He has a base that will back him on this. And I would even wager to you the majority of the country will back him on this. How is walking not on the table? The moment that he tells Europeans,
because he will be painted as the president who surrendered Ukraine to Russia.
But that is better than being painted as a president who lost Ukraine.
He could drag it out for another few years and punt it to the next president.
Oh God, I hope that's not the case, Mark.
You
might be right. Look, you could be entirely correct. I just hope that's not the case. That would suck.
There's still 100 or 200,000 18 to 25-year-old young men in Ukraine that can be drafted to buy Trump that time.
Yeah, and a good 80% is going to try to run.
No,
I mean, you have
undoubtedly, right? I mean, that number's already deflated for accounting for at least half of them escaping the country in the process, by the way.
Yeah.
That's already taken that into account. Yeah.
It just seems
I know you there is a natural desire to want to hope for a different outcome to this. I just don't think it's realistic. I would be happy to be wrong if it's not, but that's the way I see it. And I have to say, I've been listening to other people, right? I've listened to many other alternate views on this, but at the end of the day, right, I know who you just talked to before me. And the other person that I pay a special weight to what they say is John Mearsheimer. And neither one of them have any divergence from the picture I just painted. Well, Brian goes even a little bit further than I do and says this is all a pantomime. And the Europeans are just going through the motions, right? And there's no real division at all between the Americans and the Europeans, which, could be true at some level, right? But otherwise, I mean, the important thing is the outcome. The war continues, and Russia has to win it on the battlefield.
Well, Brian was slightly different. Brian, I mean, I think, okay, you would have to talk to Brian. I'll say it that way. But it sounded like Brian's take was kind of, there's like, effectively, Europe has a point of view that the Americans give it, that some of them may be true believers, like Kalis or whatever, but some of the other ones are effectively, we are following U.S. dictates, even to the degree that it damages Europe. But Donald Trump is in a fix, as you point out. They are about to have a massive military defeat, and between that military defeat and them having a tactic withdrawal, they would take the tactic withdrawal and offer something, whether or not Europe will accept it or not will depend upon what the U.S.
That's a tactical withdrawal is a logical choice. I simply don't believe that they can make that logical choice. I don't think that the institutions within the U.S., right, the media, the bipartisan congressional consensus. Lindsey Graham screaming about bone-crushing sanctions again, right? You know, because that was in the last few hours. I mean, Lindsey Graham is a piece of work, man. I posted a video of him on my own show at the end of last week, saying that God demands that the U.S. support the Israeli genocide, I guess, in Israel, and that if the U.S. doesn't, then God will punish the U.S. Meanwhile, Netanyahu is saying that God has directed him to secure a greater Israel. I mean, they're like you know, bookends, right? You know, across this book of Zionism and genocide. It's you know.
I love how God has a point of view on this stuff.
He always does, doesn't he?
God is a take. All right.
God is what we make of him, which is, considering what humanity is, then that man, he's probably a real sadistic bastard.
Yeah. I had a girlfriend at the time who, her and I were on a vacation one day, and she turns to me. Somehow we got on this conversation about homosexuality. And she says, yeah, God doesn't like gays. And it shocked the hell out of me. And her and I'm like, dude, you are bringing God into this because you are uncomfortable with your particular point of view and you're trying to raise this to the level of God. If you're going to be homophobic, just be homophobic. Don't bring God into it. Meaning, if you're going to support a genocide, just support a genocide. Don't bring God into this conversation. You know, it's nonsense. Let's talk about the battlefield. Sure. So, because I think the battlefield is setting the context to all of this. It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Ukrainian military is now incapable of plugging its gaps. That they're being flanked in regards to the last, let's say, lines of contact, or let's say lines of, what's the word I'm looking for? The last military architecture, the Slaviansk Kramatorsk conurbation.
Last defensive line, thank you. And that they're unable to fill their gaps, that they're moving and effectively shuffling people from one area to the other, almost like they're fighting fires, leaving holes in one. Yes. Explain that to us. What is going on the battlefield? There was, you know, the Russian deep penetration through the Kiev regime's defensive lines as part of their flanking of Pokrovsk, right, to cut off the supply lines into the city, right? Pokrovsk was effectively taken into an operational encirclement, right? Meaning that the Russian artillery and drones covered all of the Kiev regime's remaining supply lines into the city. And then Russian forces surged forward. They exploited one of these holes in the lines where there wasn't enough manpower to defend, and they drove deep into the Kiev regime's rear to the north and then northwest of Pokrovsk, all right, in the south-central Donbass. And they were wreaking havoc right there. It was an operational crisis. Now, over the last 5 days, the Kiev regime has launched whatever counterattacks they were able to do, right? We're Azov, the 79th Airborne, other, you know, they threw everything they had. I've seen a map of about a dozen remnants, because none of them are fully manned, brigades that were thrown up against the one Russian brigade that was the spearhead, the 132nd of the
12 and the police force.
Yeah, 12. Yeah, it was crazy looking. But again, all of these are undermanned, so take that into account. And they succeeded in stopping the Russians temporarily. And even taking back, I mean, if you were taking a look at that weird little bunny ears, the two towns to the either, so everyone was calling it the bunny ears, and I guess it works, right? It accurately describes what you're looking at. They took off the 2 ears, right? So they took a little bit of territory back, and they also gained a little bit of territory around Rodinskoye, which is that is, you know, if they were able to be more successful, then that could, you know, provide a bit more of a breather for Pokrovsk, but I don't think they're going to be able to get any further than that. I think, you know, what we've seen now is the limits of their counterattack capability. And it's costing them already near Konstantinovka, where Russia is now advancing faster because troops were pulled out of there. And Russia's already moving into Konstantinovka now, which is the bottom end of that defensive line we were talking about, and ultimately not that far from Pokrovsk, right? In fact, divided by the Russian flank now. So, I mean, and Russia is still advancing, with smaller forces committed to these areas, but forces pressing everywhere. Kupiansk, Liman, right? Seversk, Serebranka Forest, and Village are now the Kiev regime commanders now screaming about how critical the situation is in Seversk. And Seversk is the northernmost Kiev regime stronghold in the Donetsk region. It's kind of effectively separated, right? If you will remember back at a point, we were looking at Bakhmut and Sleboda and then Seversk. And Russia took out Sleboda in the middle and then eventually took out Bakhmut. And they never committed huge numbers of resources to it. But what they did commit, everything failed to take Seversk. Seversk held for the Kiev regime, much like Ugledar did in the south for the longest time. And these were kind of like the twin strongholds. They weren't big, huge population centers by any stretch of the imagination, but they were effective military strongholds, one to the north and one to the south, Seversk and Ugledar, pinning the Kiev regime's defensives in the Donbass. And first, Ugledar was taken, I guess already close to 3 months ago. And now it looks like Seversk is finally succumbing as well. That was a long. Again, Russia didn't commit massive resources to that. Their timing is their sense of timing for these things happening on the battlefield. They don't commit resources where they don't have to. While everything's supposed to click into place at the right time, as it is now moving on the last defensive line. So it seems they now need to make Seversk fall, so they are. But that's the situation. And I mean, we even had the Telegraph at the end of the last week talking about even the Kiev regime's forces that want to continue fighting don't want to fight for Zelensky, right? And that was
interesting.
That they hate him, right? And the Telegraph article didn't come out and say it, but of course these are the Banderites, right? They hate Zelensky, right? They want to fight. Nothing will make them stop fighting. They'll fight to the bitter end, but they hate Zelensky, and that puts them in a bit of a pickle because they can't turn on him now, no matter what he does, because that would abandon the front line. But they hate him all the same. So that does, of course, create a further limitation in what he himself is capable of doing diplomatically, because he would be turned on. But I think he's internalized all of this Banderite nonsense at this point anyway. So I don't think it would really make a difference. He obviously has a bit of a messiah complex himself. I mean, his own people have spoken of him as delusional. So Russia continues. They're grinding away at the battlefield. The grinding is just happening at a faster rate than it has before. And that rate will continue to increase over time. But still, I will point out how big Ukraine is. I would expect to see sometime by the end of the year another big drive at conscription in Ukraine, aiming at some new, whether we're talking 18 to 25-year-olds or women, or both. I mean, that's going to be necessary. But we may yet see a Kiev regime offensive.
Where?
In the Bryansk region. They're attempting to mass forces on the Russian border in the Bryansk region. Again, probably under some insane delusion that they can seize territory briefly in Bryansk, as they did in Kursk, and then trade it to Russia in diplomatic talks that aren't really going to happen anyway. So I don't know why they're bothering with this. The talks are never going to reach that far. But they're attempting to critically mass forces on the Russian border with Bryansk in the north. Again, Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, right on the Russian side of the border up there. So they're in the tip of the Sumy region, right? Sumy. Anyway, they're in the Sumy region. They're attempting to mass forces on the Kiev regime side. They've launched a number of attacks on like transmission towers, and they've sent DRG groups in. All these things that you do before you launch an attack. Now, Russia knows this, and they're pounding. Right, they're hitting them with artillery, they're hitting them with missiles. So whether they'll be able to mass that critical mass to effectively bring it together that is needed to launch an offensive, or as they attempt to do so, Russia will be able to destroy it, we're going to find out. But I've heard numbers of 25,000, which is the upside edge of what they might be capable, and it will of course shorten. Out the other side of that, it will shorten their ability to defend other areas, right? Because those forces could be far better used at least in time, right? Defending somewhere else. It's a lot easier to send a conscripted person to defend a trench line with a gun than it is to order them to make assaults on Russian positions and towns and that sort of thing. It's delusional, but I think we should have long since given up the idea that Zelensky will ever have his military, because Syrskyi just does what he's told, do the logical thing, do the militarily sensible thing. They will never do that. They will never withdraw forces, no matter how strategically, tactically sound that is. They will never do it. They will never, stop trying to go on the offensive. They're just not going to stop. They do not accept defeat, right? And there's every reason to understand why they wouldn't, because the Europeans are still backing them and gathering around Zelensky like an adoring horde, and propelling him to Washington and elsewhere, right? And why would he order that? I mean, he hasn't even been in Ukraine in a week, I think. And he's not going to be there soon because he's going to Washington today. So he's at I think he's at a psychological degree of removal from the battlefield. First of all, obviously his own people are afraid they cannot tell him the truth because he is an emperor with no clothes. And even what sense that he gets of the real situation on the battlefield, he just refuses to internalize, to acknowledge it, right? It just, duck off. I
think he's a man in the future. I mean, the other idea is he's not insane. He just has no future. Like every Ukrainian that he sacrifices is one day extra he gets to live.
I think he's insane. I want to be frank. I think he's mad.
Oh, you think he's just lost it?
I think he's lost it. I think he's a poor little man that was cast into a role that he, as an actor that he has been unable to fulfill, and has just gone mad. I think he's crazy. I mean, in a way that not even Donald Trump is crazy. I think Zelensky is crazy.
What's wild about that? If instead of that stupid offensive, they would have just made their defensive lines, hardened their defensive lines, it would have been a much harder nut to crack, as opposed to losing all of these people.
But hey, we'll dominate the headlines for a couple weeks, and then there'll be another, yay, sticking it to the Russians, right? I mean, look, Putin can't even defend his own country nonsense. I mean, we can write the headlines now if you want. Again, they may not be able to do it, right? Again, Russia is pounding, right, as they attempt to mass the critical force needed to then surge across the border, right, at a relatively lightly defended area, because what is in Bryansk? Even less than in Kursk, right? I mean, but that's why they're attacking it, right? It's a heavily forested area. It's easy for them to hide stuff, particularly now with foliage, on the trees and everything. They're attempting to mass a critical force, and the reason again is primarily narrative driven, right? It's political and narrative driven. It makes no military sense, but we should have long learned the lesson now that they're not making decisions based on military sense, which again ultimately has led to them losing this to the to the degree that they are. But hey, they'll dominate headlines for a few weeks, and that's more important to Zelensky than anything that makes any sense.
When Seversk and Kramatorsk falls, then what? I mean, at that point, that would effectively be the Russians liberated.
I think you mean Seversk and Konstantinovka. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will come a little bit after that. So, right. but if you mean what happens after Russia takes Donbass,
yes,
there'll be another wave of hysteria in Europe. There'll be another window of opportunity for them to see sense and come to the negotiation table, and the Russian forces, right? I imagine they'll continue, but there will probably be a bit of a pause still, right? Where the Kremlin will give enough of a breath to say, "Are you done yet?" And they'll say no, and then Russia will continue on to Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, right? In a bigger, they're already in both, of course, but in a bigger way, right? I expect that the Donbass will either be liberated or all but liberated by the end of this year, all things considered, right? They're Slavyansk and Kramatorsk might be hanging on by the end of the year, but the writing will be on the wall. And then next year we'll probably see big moves into Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, right? Again, I don't think they'll ever attack Kharkov. They'll probably attempt to force a withdrawal of the Kiev regime forces for Kharkov, but they'll never do that anyway because they never withdraw. So that'll force some kind of confrontation there. I would really like to see them make another play for Kiev sometime next year. I think that the Kiev regime forces, I don't think they're going to collapse again to the extent that some people do, that they're just going to one day say, we can't fight anymore, let's sign surrender papers. But I think they'll crumble enough that Russia will be able to one of the things Russia is not doing on their offensive now is they're not using large numbers of military vehicles, right? They're not using armor. They're using very limited numbers of infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. Why? Because still of the threat of drones. It's not worth it. But as they continue to dominate the battlefield more, and they're making all these offensives without that, right? This is essentially drone and artillery and FAB assisted infantry, right? That's what's happening right now. But both sides have long since switched to that. It's just the realities of drone warfare and 24/7 satellite surveillance. It demands a new battlefield. But eventually, the Kiev regime's ability to screen their forces with drones, their defensive positions, that's weakening, right? And then they're already experiencing such gaps in manpower terms in their defenses that Russia will be able to sometime within the next year, right? Any time from 2 months to a full year from now, be able to reinsert large numbers of armored vehicles because there won't be as much of a threat to waste them because of drone screens. And that will make things move much faster, of course. And that will open up the opportunity for another move on Kiev, another, decapitation strike. But, that's already months into the future. And then we're way in fog of war territory there.
No, I understand. Can we talk about Azerbaijan real quick before what time is it?
If we must.
I am fascinated by this. God, man, I am fascinated by this. I love the this kind of subversive politics that takes place in countries. Russia would come out overtly. Azerbaijan is taking an unfriendly action. It is okay. We still want to make diplomatic relations. The world is great. And then, bam, there's your oil refinery. bam, there's this building that you apparently had in Ukraine. Meaning they're effectively using Ukraine as a grounds by which to exert pressure on Azerbaijan. Like recently, I think it was yesterday, maybe even, they blew up one of Azerbaijan's main oil refineries in Ukraine. And apparently there were several mercenaries that were liquidated, quote unquote, which one being caught, and come to find out these were mercenaries that were let out of Azerbaijan prisons in order to fight in the war in Ukraine. We also, on some level, believe that Azerbaijan had been working in order to assist with either drones being flown into Russia. So you have, in some case, Russia hitting these various aspects of Azerbaijan from an economic standpoint and going after some of the mercenaries that are in Ukraine. Basically, we are going to use Ukraine as a platform by which to go after you. Even though...
And that's okay, because Azerbaijan is going to do the same.
Yes. Well, I don't think it's okay either way, just because I think it's screwed up that both countries are doing it. But whatever, they're doing it, right? Yeah. It's fascinating to me that this is taking place.
And understand that everything that Azerbaijan does has Erdogan looming behind it.
Interesting.
I mean,
interesting.
Aliyev is Azerbaijan's sidekick. Come on. Everything that he does is agreed to with Erdogan.
But Azerbaijan is not a proxy of Istanbul, is it? I mean,
yeah, they are. I mean, they're at least a junior ally of. I mean, that would be generous, I think. I mean, everything they do is backed by Turkey. Everything that happened with Armenia was backed by Turkey, right?
Yes.
All of this whole supposed trip road, this Trump, this insertion of the U.S. as a geopolitical coup d'etat.
Whatever that thing's called.
What was previously the Zangezur corridor, now the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. All right.
Which, by the way, is anything but.
I have nothing to base this on, but I am, or very little, I should say. I have a belief that this was all Erdogan's plan that he presented to Trump. This is the cunning beast plan.
Well, I do think
to drag the U.S. into the Caucasus.
But the U.S. would want to do that anyway, right? I mean, from my standpoint, primacy. I have no belief that the U.S. is given a primacy, and in the same way that Trump is like, "Hey, Putin, let's make a deal," while I simultaneously work in Armenia and Azerbaijan in order to get into the soft underbelly.
The problem is that Armenia is a landlocked country. Right, with a high degree of political opposition to their West-backed leader, that is, repressing the population, the Armenian Apostolic Church, everything at this point. And previous U.S. presidents have had the sense to not send forces there, to understand that was beyond their geopolitical reach. Right, stir up domestic, support. Pashinyan from afar, sure, but they weren't going to get dragged into it. But this whole idea of selling it to Trump as a lease of a PMC or corporation, and the U.S. basically buying, parachuting in and buying out the South Caucasus, right? That to me just speaks of Erdogan, selling Trump on an idea that he can't resist. Much like Trump is, well, again, when I say Trump, someone, it was put forward by the Trump administration to buy the Nord Stream pipelines and restart the flow of energy to Europe, but under U.S. control, right? I mean, that this sort of appeal to companies doing things as proxies of the U.S. is very Trumpian, right? That it's not something that has a history before that. So that's why, and Erdogan has been shepherding this whole, bringing of Aliyev and Pashinyan together, right? Of convincing Pashinyan to go along with it, right? Pashinyan is essentially selling out Suksyn province in Armenia to Armenia's own historical and present day enemies, Turkey and Azerbaijan, on either side. Why? Because he believes that this secures him a place in the Western geopolitical influence sphere, and he's willing to sacrifice his own country for that. They found a way to sell this corridor under U.S. protection, right? Under U.S. ownership for 100 years, right? And that is now the Russians or Iranians are obviously taken aback by all of this.
Yes,
this
which is why
they're divided on a response. The Iranians are making all sorts of threats, right? And
it's
military threats. Well, the Russians are more reserved, shall we say. I think part of the calculation in the Kremlin is this is never going to work. They're never going to be able to pull this off. The logistics of it are just insane. And the domestic political opposition in Armenia will grow, and Pashinyan will have to shove this through domestic political bodies at some point. It is just never going to work. That's why I think you haven't seen as much of a response from Russia as the more visceral response that you've seen from Iran. Now, is that going to be the way it plays out? I don't know, right? I don't know whether America can really pull this off. But it is without a doubt that something that the Russians and the Iranians are both like, you're going to what?
Why are the Russians being so cavalier with this? Like that, I got to be honest, Mark, that annoys the hell out of me. Especially
they don't think it's going to work. They think it's a crazy Hail Mary pass that is ultimately going to be dropped. Right?
Okay.
That the logistics of supplying a PMC in a war-torn, hatred-riven South Caucasus, south of Russia, that you're going to, I don't know, Berlin Airlift supply a PMC there and make it work, right? And smooth over relations between Armenia and, get Armenia to play dead long enough, for all of this to go through. I just don't think, I think ultimately there'll be political opposition in Armenia that will take back the leadership of their country, that will reject all of this. And then almost certainly you'll see a resuscitation of war between Armenia and Turkey and Azerbaijan, at which point Turkey and Azerbaijan will, like wolves from both sides, will just rip our southern Armenia apart.
Yes.
And Armenia is in its own way going to be fed into this geopolitical meat grinder against Russia. And the truth of the matter is that since the end of the Soviet Union, Russia was going to inevitably lose influence in the South Caucasus, right? This has all been building. They have maintained influence there by maintaining the balance between Armenia and Azerbaijan, diplomatically, militarily, but also to a certain extent, let's be honest, playing one another off of each other. Well, that game is now.
Explain why, though. I don't understand why. Like, why did they
for control? For control, because they were the biggest dog. Why are they going to lose influence? Because that game is now over, right? Nagorno-Karabakh, Pashinyan surrendered it to Turkey. Yes. The occupied territories are over. Armenia is a weak country, right? They're a landlocked little country with no natural resources, and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Turkey are both flush and feeling very, shall we say, expansionist and feeling their strength. They know that both Russia and Iran are focused elsewhere geopolitically, so they're flexing, right? And they can do it. And Russia, at this point, I'm sure there's people that in the Kremlin are saying, the South Caucasus. You know what I'm saying? It's yes, geopolitical terms, the soft underbelly and everything, but really, we're done with it, right? I mean, to a certain extent, they're like, it's not worth it to get drawn into that rat's nest. And certainly they're everything on their plate is now consumed with defeating NATO in Ukraine, right? I mean, that has to be the priority over everything. So yeah, Azerbaijan is feeling their strength. Again, it's a thing that has there was probably long simmering Azerbaijan resentment under the surface. But for 2 decades, more than 2 decades now, Russia and Azerbaijan have had very, I don't want to say friendly, but very effective business-like, relations. And now all of a sudden that's up in flames. Azerbaijan is, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just saying that's the part I'm confused by.
Who are Aliyev's 2 biggest allies?
Well, Turkey and I don't know the other one.
Israel.
Oh, right. I got a new axis, but I guess it's not a new axis.
So yeah. I mean, well, it's been an axis in formation, and now it's more so than ever before, right? There's payback for everything geopolitically, and Iran not only gets a little bit of payback against Russia, but they get a lot of maneuver against Iran, right? Because Azerbaijan is right there. And if this whole thing comes to fruition, then Iran's trade route to Armenia, and thus, a land trade route, will be completely cut off. There's all of this. Russia still has a military base in
Armenia.
But
right.
Pashinyan wants that gone. That's part of all of this maneuvering. He wants out of the Russian sphere of influence, and he wants the Western sphere of influence extended over Armenia and the rest of the South Caucasus. And Turkey and Azerbaijan, I believe, have sold this project to Washington now, as an extension. Now, Turkey and Azerbaijan, of course, have their own game, right? Yes, they're dovetailing with the West here, bandwagon, bringing the U.S. in and everything. But ultimately, they've got their Erdogan has his vision on some pan-Turkic sphere of influence. And ultimately, part of what they want to do on an economic level is sell China on the stability of the own middle corridor for the One Belt, One Road to go under Russia, rather than investing in the over route over the Caspian Sea, right, into this. And now China will have to make both an economic and a geopolitical decision on that, but that's at least part of Erdogan's calculation here. So it's from Azerbaijan. Yeah, energy pipelines, gas pipelines from Azerbaijan will now go through this previously Zangezur corridor through Armenia into Turkey and then on to Europe, right? Providing Europe with, well, not as much natural gas as Russia could, but, at least a partial pipeline supply, which is cheaper and more reliable than U.S. shipped LNG. So big pipeline politics are calculation.
One last
of
question
what's going on.
Before I let you go. Do you think there's secret provisions in the deal set between Azerbaijan and Armenia that would bring them into NATO?
I think there are probably not. I think that probably it was discussed, and then probably, anything's possible, right? And it was discussed as a future development if it all works out, right? But I don't think that there was a secret protocol signed into it where that is something that is automatically going to happen. That's a more distant prospect. But certainly the U.S. would love to then, you don't want NATO close to your border? Here's 2 more. We took Finland and Sweden, and now in the Caucasus, we've got your former, client states, Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. I absolutely believe that there are some people in the bowels of the Russia desk, right, in the U.S. deep state, who are there. We can see where this is going, that are absolutely on board. Does that mean that Trump, is aware of this? I don't know. It's possible. I mean, he doesn't even attend most of his intelligence briefings, so he gets his news from Fox. And what Trump knows and doesn't know is a fool's game, because ultimately it does not matter. Because the institutions of the hegemon are on autopilot, right? Where they receive resistance and obstruction from Trump, they just manage that, flow around it and continue on with their what is their inevitable, process, regardless. I'm sorry, I'm a structural realist.
You are fantastic, and I deeply appreciate you on this. We are going to see how this all plays out. Thank you for delving into the Azerbaijan Armenia thing. I'm sorry, I was pushing just because I was trying to get it into in a certain amount of time frame. Thank you for this, Mark. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1, and you can find him on Boosty, Boosty, at Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda, or under the name just Mark Sleboda. Mark, you have a fantastic day, man. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. All right. Best in the business, Mark Sleboda. I want to go to my next guest. He is new to this channel, and so I greatly appreciate him for joining me. And I want to make sure I get your last name right. David
Hundeyin.
One more time.
Hundeyin.
Hundeyin. Thank you. I am a butcher of names. That's what I'm going to ask, as opposed to just kind of running with it. How you doing, man? Thank you for this. Thank you for joining me. And just so the audience would know, David is an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker. He's founder of West Africa Weekly and 2023 James Curie Fellow at Cambridge University. What is that? You got to tell us what that one is.
All right. So the James Curie Fellowship is a literary fellowship at the University of Cambridge, which is it's named after James Curry, who was the co-founder of the African Writers series. So if you've ever read anything from authors like Chinua Achebe,
yes,
Bessie
When
Head,
Things Fall Apart.
so
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So James Curry was the co.
Come back. Oh, come back. Oh, he'll be back. He's frozen right now.
Oh, there you are.
There you are. Yeah, you're frozen. It's okay. So you're saying we got most of it.
Right. So yeah, I was saying that the literary fellowship at Cambridge is named, the African Literary Fellowship is named after James Curry. So it's basically a fellowship which once a year takes in an African author of some reputation who, based on the criteria determined by the department of the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge.
Yeah.
They decided, okay, this guy's interesting. So I applied in 2022, and I was fortunate to be accepted in 2023.
Very cool. Oh, that's very cool, man. Very cool. So I brought you on because I guess there are multiple parts of Africa that I want to discuss. And I got to be honest, it doesn't really get enough coverage, even on this channel. I think I have maybe one, maybe two African analysts. It's a big continent, and that continent is going to be playing a much larger role in geopolitical politics, especially in the Sahel region. And so thank you for joining me. I have conversations on this. I know Sudan is not in the Sahel. I want to put that out there in front, right? But one of my audience members, Jonay, she has been asking for a conversation about what is taking place in South Sudan, at least for weeks. And I told her the first time I get the opportunity to have somebody to discuss it, I will do so. And so let's step into this. What is happening? I mean, my understanding, there was a civil war in South Sudan. Why is there a civil war in South Sudan? How did it take place? Give us, I guess, a background summary just for us to step into the topic.
So the publicly available narrative is that there was a schism between what is now North Sudan and South Sudan. Essentially, that the North Sudanese, or the Sudanese, which obviously identify as Arab, even though they look, again, there's something very interesting going on there, because if you look at them, they're clearly phenotypically African, but they self-identify as Arab. And in situations like that, as often tends to be the case, you basically have a civil war, which is basically what was happening, because you have the South Sudanese who did not identify as Arab, and especially did not identify as Muslim. So they were Christian, they were African traditional religionists primarily, and the government, the former Sudanese government of a guy called Omar al-Bashir, for whatever reason, had this idea that um, for the sake of national cohesion of Sudan or whatever it was, that any identity apart from Arab Muslim had to be extinguished, right? So this guy, he created this thing which he's now historically known as the Janjaweed militia. So basically, what they were is they were a non-state group whose primary remit was essentially to commit genocide. They were a non-state group, but they operated under sort of a nudge-wink agreement with the Sudanese state. This is all documented, by the way, and this went on.
No, I don't disagree with you. It's just that is astonishing. I mean, you have two. If you're in Egypt, for example, you have Nubians and you have Arabs, and they just kind of coexist. And it's like, hey, you're Nubian, you're like me, or these other people aren't. If one turns around and says, hey, let's kill everybody else, that's pretty out there. But please, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so again, which is why I said it's the accepted narrative, because for those who are not familiar with the sheer amount of foreign interference and meddling that goes on in Africa, and who just hear of these African conflicts, it's very easy to get the idea that, oh, well, this is just what Africans are. Africans just wake up one morning and just randomly start killing each other. So according to the public narrative, that's what it was. It was a bunch of Africans deciding to kill another bunch of Africans because of their religion or their assumed ethnicity or whatever, which is true on some level. But the story that is not told is that what was behind this, because just to be clear, the fact that Sudanese are both Christian and Muslim, are both Arab and Dinka and Nuer or whatever, that is something that has existed for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It's not a new thing. So the reason why over the past 2 or 3 decades, it became something that led to the genocide in Darfur and in South Sudan, that was externally instigated. That's a story that is almost entirely glossed over. And I think part of the reason the story is almost entirely glossed over is that it's not the type of external interference that we're sort of used to dealing with, because the type of external interference we're used to hearing about in Africa is primarily Western political interference from the US and from its European allies. In this case, this was interference from states in the Gulf. So the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE specifically, these states, I guess a lot of people don't realize this, these states also have their own designs on expanding their sphere of influence, right? Everyone is trying to build an empire in Africa's neighborhood, except Africans, fortunately or unfortunately. So as I caught a bit of a last conversation you had with the previous guest, where he mentioned that the Turkish government has this idea of sort of reviving the old Ottoman Empire. Yeah. The Europeans obviously have their own, different European countries have their own empires carved out historically, which are now shrinking. The US obviously has the entire world, or it intends to have the entire world as its stomping ground. The Russians are building, they have their own obvious sphere of influence as well. And so do the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They have exactly the same thing. It's just not as publicly recognized, so it flies under the radar a lot. And Sudan, unfortunately, happens to be the key flashpoint on the African continent, where these guys feel like this is where their influence can be brought to bear, the UAE specifically. Because the story of what led to the division of Sudan and South Sudan kind of flows into the story of what is still happening in both Sudan and South Sudan, even today, as we speak. Part of the reason that is that this Janjaweed militia that I referenced earlier, which was sort of raised as a non-state militia to go around murdering Africans who didn't identify as Muslims.
Come on. This is interesting. I'm learning something. Go on.
Why does that keep happening? Okay.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah. So
You're fine. No, you're perfectly fine. Oh, come
We've
on.
gone off again.
No,
Morphed
you're
into
fine.
morphed into what we now know as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. Because basically what happened was, after the end of the Darfur genocide, it didn't really end, but for the sake of convention, we all like to pretend that it did. And after the division of North Sudan and South Sudan, the Janjaweed militia didn't really have a purpose anymore. So the Sudanese government then, the military government then, repurposed this Janjaweed militia into something called the Rapid Support Forces, which was supposed to act as a sort of co-military, if that makes sense. And the primary reason for doing this, was not because they thought it made sense or they wanted it to be the case, but it was that these are battle-hardened people who have been fighting for years, some decades. They're well armed, they're well resourced. So what are you going to do with them when they no longer have something to fight for? Right? So you can't just. Yeah, that was the idea. But the thing is, these people have operated outside of conventional military command for so long. They have their own command structure. They have their own economic structure as well. Because something else, which I guess isn't also widely talked about, is that a lot of the funding that kept this organization alive also came from things like illegal mining, gold mining in Sudan, because Sudan obviously is a large producer of gold. So the nexus, I'm sure you're aware of the nexus between Dubai, which is in the UAE, and the global illegal gold trade. Dubai is like the HQ of illegal gold trafficking, basically. So these guys had basically figured out an entire parallel funding structure to keep the organizations going. So as the Sudanese government, you can't just tell them, okay, you're done, everybody go home, because that would lead to a civil war, because they can exist without you, and they have their arms, they have everything they need to exist and to fight. So the idea was to create this sort of nervous balance between the Sudanese armed forces and this so-called RSF. As you can imagine, that didn't last very long, because the RSF kept trying to assert itself and kept trying to become more powerful. And the Sudanese armed forces eventually said, look, you're done. No. Right, we're going to reintegrate you into the army. So the Sudanese armed forces, they proposed a plan where within 2 years, most of the RSF will be incorporated into the Sudanese armed forces, and the RSF proposed a counter plan which was going to stretch this out to 10 years. So obviously you can get the import of what was going on here. They had no intention of being integrated into the Sudanese military, and that was when the current civil war in Sudan broke out, which is still going on. And I think it's been very well documented how the RSF receives regular military shipments from the UAE. It's been very, very well documented. It's been on the news. It's been covered. So that's not a secret. Who has an interest in funding the RSF, which is the direct descendant of the Janjaweed militia? So that's for Sudan, or North Sudan. Now, South Sudan, that is it's a story with many moving parts. So as an African, as a Black African, it's very easy to feel a lot of sympathy for the South Sudanese cause, from my point of view, because for the longest time, basically, they were suffering.
Come on.
Hello?
Okay. Yeah, you're back. Okay, go ahead. Oh, come on.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why that keeps happening. I'm not sure if my Wi-Fi does this, because I don't know. This seems to happen whenever I'm streaming, live streaming. It doesn't happen any other time. Very weird. Anyway, so they were suffering a genocide for decades, and in 2011, then they had the referendum, the UN aided referendum, where they split off and became an independent country. And in fairness to them, the amount of development that they've witnessed since 2011 is probably more than at any point since Sudan became an independent country.
Wow.
So to put this into perspective, as at 2011, Juba, which was
Yeah, he is a good guess. Restless native. He is. No, he is. Oh, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
okay.
It's queuing.
Yeah.
No, what's going on is queuing. It's sometimes if the Wi-Fi, sometimes if it depends on the streaming software. If you cut down the frames per something, I'm not.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not great with this. So I'm not great with this.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So I was saying that as at 2011, I think the entire country had less than 500 kilometers of paved roads at the time. So part of the genocide that had been inflicted on them, it wasn't just direct violence; it was also structural violence. So the government in Khartoum had made sure that as little investment as possible had gone into the parts of the country that were deemed to be undesirable, because the ultimate goal was basically to make these people disappear and then repopulate these areas with people that were considered Arab or Berber,
Basically, Arabs, Muslims, etc.
They really had nothing.
You're frustrated. You're fine. You're fine. It happens. It happens. Go for it.
So at the point they gained independence, they really had nothing. But what they did have going for them was that South Sudan, as you know, is oil rich. So they had an opportunity to actually build infrastructure and build a government, build a country, which to a certain extent they have done to a certain extent, because if you compare Juba now to Juba in 2011, it's absolute night and day. I mean, they now have 4-star hotels and expressways and things that just didn't exist a decade and a half ago. So they have done reasonably well for themselves. Now, where the complication comes in is that it would be a mistake to then think that this is a simple story of a group of people who bravely fought for freedom from oppression and fought for their independence, and they're now making their brave way in the world. That's a very romantic way of looking at it from the point of view of an African. Unfortunately, that's also completely inaccurate, because the part of the story that isn't told is that the US government played a central role in making that referendum possible. And the reason it did that wasn't because...
Oh, this is going to get interesting. Let's get into Wesley Clark. Come on.
Right.
No, go ahead. Keep going. You said the U.S. played a central role in making sure that referendum took place.
Okay, I'm just going to switch the Wi-Fi altogether.
Now, what was... Oh, he's switching. He's flipping Wi-Fi. Okay. Maybe just audio will work okay.
Yeah, I've switched my Wi-Fi connection. I've switched the Wi-Fi connection, so let's hope this one holds up.
Okay. So you said the U.S., the reason that this took place was because the U.S. got involved and made sure that referendum took place, basically splitting off South Sudan from Sudan.
Yeah, so the geopolitical calculation that the US government was making was something which was completely unknown to most of us at the time, because I witnessed these events like in real time, even though I wasn't there, but I was following these things fairly closely at the time. And I had no idea of things that were happening in the background, because apparently what was happening in the background was that in Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya is like next door to South Sudan, a bunch of US diplomats had basically set up shop there for years with the goal of negotiating the breakup of Sudan into North Sudan and South Sudan.
Please let me interrupt you on that one. Wesley Clark. So Wesley Clark here in the U.S. made this point back in 2020 that the U.S. objective was effectively topple all of these governments in the Middle East. Sudan was one of those.
I'm getting that.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So the goal was not to protect South Sudanese people by giving them an independent republic. The goal was to break up Sudan. So in the process of breaking up Sudan, I guess a byproduct of that was that the South Sudanese people then got their own homeland, which I guess they're kind of happy about. But the main objective primarily was the breakup of Sudan. And the reason Sudan needed to be broken up, as was very eloquently spoken about recently by you mentioned Wesley Clark. Other prominent US commentators have spoken about this recently. There was I forget his name now. He's a well-known economics professor. I forget his name.
Jeffrey Sachs.
Yes, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs. Yes, he spoke about that fairly recently as well. The goal was essentially every country in the Middle East and North Africa whose geopolitical position on Israel was hostile, that country needed to be taken out. So, and the definition of taken out means different things in different places. So in Iraq, it meant that the Ba'ath Party and the regime of Saddam Hussein needed to be, consigned to history. In Syria, it meant the same thing. But in Sudan, it meant that in addition to just regime change, the country itself, just by its existence, was deemed to be a threat to Israel. So the country needed to be split up. So if you look at it's very interesting the way it was split up. It was split up in such a way that all of the oil resources, which are basically which were the country's primary source of government revenue at the time, all of the oil resources, which were located in the southern part of the country, the demarcation was done in such a careful manner that they all fell within South Sudan. So essentially, North Sudan was stripped of all its financial capacity to present any kind of a problem to Benjamin Netanyahu. So South Sudan then sort of, saw itself, aflush with these like newfound riches. If one wasn't familiar with the geopolitics behind all of this, it would have been very easy to think of this as some sort of romantic story. It wasn't, right? And these riches didn't come without strings attached. One of the strings attached is some of the things we've been seeing over the past few weeks, where Donald Trump's most outrageous, outlandish ideas that no one else has been willing to accept always seem to find an audience in South Sudan. So, for example, the decision to start deporting people to third countries, that's these countries are not the countries that they come from, and it's not the country they're being deported from. So it's a third country that has absolutely nothing to do with this person. And these are some of the very worst people in the world. So you have child molesters, you have rapists, you have people who rape people living with mental disabilities. You had all sorts of things, kidnappers, drug traffickers on that list. And the South Sudanese government say, hey, we'll happily take them in because the US is looking for a destination for these people. And, the South Sudanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually put out a statement saying openly that because the US stood by them during the referendum era and the US was so useful to them during their fight for independence, so in the spirit of shared interests or whatever the hell that was, then they responded positively to this request, right? So essentially, South Sudan has taken up a role as the dustbin of the US empire, and it's a permanent role. It's a role that isn't going to stop. And the reason it's taken on that role is because, well, from its point of view, one good turn deserves another. So the US government helped it to gain independence from Sudan. So in return, it has to do absolutely everything that the US government asks of it. We even saw recently where the proposal was mentioned. I believe this came out in the news that South Sudan was being spoken to about the possibility of taking in Palestinians who are supposedly due to be evicted from Gaza. I mean, anyone who has any sort of basic historical awareness on this entire continent knows that that would be an absolute disaster. Under no circumstances should South Sudan or any African country allow itself to be used as the destination for people who are being expelled from their own land. It's not going to end well, not for them and not for the country in question. It just will not end well for anyone concerned. But South Sudan officially put out a disclaimer saying they are not in any such conversations. But I believe this was the Telegraph. I'm reading the story now, and it was the story came out the day after the denial, and he said that even though they put out a denial, that the source that the Telegraph has been speaking to is positive, that there are four-way talks going on about the expulsion of Gazans from Gaza, and that South Sudan is involved in those talks. So essentially, this independence that South Sudan was gifted by virtue of the US, this independence from North Sudan, isn't independence at all. They basically turned into a geopolitical vassal state of the US, and not in a good way at all.
So one part of Sudan ends up in war, and the other one ends up a vassal, which effectively diminishes both.
Exactly. Wow. So basically, any sort of geopolitical threats that Sudan as a whole might have once presented, whether to Israel or to the US or whatever, has been completely neutralized. So half of Sudan, the upper half of Sudan, the goal for anyone who I guess has a functioning pair of eyes is to keep it enmeshed in conflict for as long as possible, never ending conflict, right? Because it's clear that there, on the one hand, you have the Sudanese armed forces and the majority of the Sudanese population. That much is clear. And on the other hand, you have this group which has zero legitimacy, which is not recognized internationally, which seems to keep getting all this funding and support and equipment, and they just keep it going. This civil war has been going on for, 3 years now, and it shows no signs of stopping. Most recently, you've been seeing the rapid support forces getting hold of drones, carrying out airstrikes. Where does it happen that a rebel force, essentially, for lack of a better term, a terrorist force, has access to an air, to air support? How is that possible? So you can obviously tell that this is being heavily supported and funded by people with the geopolitical interests, not necessarily in even capturing Sudan and taking over the Sudanese state, because I think we now know that's not a realistic outcome.
Just keep that war.
It's not realistically going to happen. But the goal is just to keep the war going for as long as possible, keep Sudan in a state of constant and ongoing instability, in a manner similar to what has been done to Somalia as well. Because I believe Somalia was also on that list of states mentioned by General Wesley Clark. So sometimes the goal is not necessarily just regime change. Sometimes the very existence of the country is the threat. And to neutralize that threat, you either basically split the country up into multiple bits, which are then enmeshed in their own sort of petty conflicts, which, no one ever asks, how is it that someone is always willing to fund these things? Because war is not cheap. And nobody ever asks that question in Africa. How is the world's poorest continent or the world's poorest people? How do they always find the fantastic sums of money involved in carrying out large-scale military conflict for years or decades at a time? So it's either that, or even if the country is left, substantially intact as a corporate state, you just enmesh it in civil war to time indefinite. And that seems to be exactly what is happening in front of us.
Yeah, man, there's always some fascist, thick-neck lunatic that's willing to do things for cash. It's like, hey, you seem like a pretty undesirable fella. Let me give you some money. Are you willing to go kill people? And they say, yeah, I am. Yeah, the RSF thing blew my mind. Because, it's like, it's a second military. And it's like, well, the dispensation of force, how are you going to have it in two places? It's one or the other. I mean, it's like the Prigozhin thing, right? In Russia, where you have this paramilitary group, and all of a sudden he's like, I want to take over Russia. Okay. Man, thank you for this. Fantastic breakdown. Because I have to be honest, we covered this, but we didn't cover it necessarily in depth when I was at the network. We saw it take place. We understood that this was on the list of countries, but the mechanics of it, I didn't understand. And I didn't quite understand how these countries, how the split took place why the split took place, how the war was going on between the, I guess you can say, Northern Sudanese or the Sudanese military versus the RSF, as you kept saying, or as you pointed out, how they're being funded, meaning they're having a large-scale conflict with a country and yet are able to keep going with the country. It puts you in the mind of, what is that country? Ethiopia, where you have like the former government, it'll come to me in a moment, attacks the actual Ethiopian government. And the US media, the way the media reports it is, the Ethiopian government is attacking the TPLF. And it's like, whoa, that didn't happen. That wasn't it. That wasn't it.
Yeah.
It was so warped the way they were reporting here because the TPLF, of course, was associated with, had previous connections with the US and opposed to just kind of reporting it honestly. The former government tries to overthrow the actual government of Ethiopia. They report it in a different way. And it's like, okay, where are they getting the weapons?
So
how are you fighting full-blown government?
I think you've mentioned something very important because it's emblematic of, I guess, US foreign policy toward Africa. If you've noticed, it seems to be the case that wherever there's a geographically big African country, so be that Ethiopia, be that Somalia, be that Nigeria, be that Sudan, even DRC to a lesser extent, you will often find a very interesting theme running through all of them, which is that for whether stated or unstated, the US the government's position seems to be that these countries in their large states should not be allowed to exist.
Yes. That
in some way, shape, or form, having these countries exist as a unitary state with a powerful central government is not a desirable thing. So instead, in Ethiopia, you will often find solutions proposed such as that which used to be the case prior to Abiy Ahmed, where you essentially have different regions of the country having their own governments, and essentially the country lacks a unified central government. So the country basically has no real geopolitical leverage. The country has no unified foreign policy. It barely has a military to speak of. It's just, it's just like a cobbled together thing, which is just sort of hanging on for dear life. Something similar going on in Nigeria now, where these secessionist movements, which pretty much didn't exist in any, definitely not in a violent sense. They didn't exist a decade and a half ago. All of a sudden, you then have, if you've heard of this policy think tank called the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which is one of the most powerful think tanks in the whole of Washington. You then have the AEI putting out op-eds, right, putting out articles, policy proposals on its website, stating that the US government should stand behind Biafran secessionists and that they are being oppressed, by the brutal Nigerian government in Abuja. Now, obviously, I'm not holding any brief whatsoever for the Nigerian government. I myself, I've had my life, almost ended by the Nigerian government, right? They're not nice people. But the point is that the US government is not has no interest in protecting the lives of the Biafrans or whatever, the same way it had no interest in protecting the lives of South Sudanese. The point of this is to break up a large African country that has the potential to someday become economically and politically powerful. That's the goal. Similar thing to what is happening in the DRC, where you have these groups like M23, which this has been documented in so many different ways that these groups have international support, including US support, right? So the actual Congolese government in Kinshasa basically doesn't have the capacity to enforce its will more than 200 kilometers from Kinshasa. So basically the majority of the country is just ungoverned territory. Right? And you have these little fiefdoms that rule different bits of the country, and they all happen to be friendly with the US. Right? So it's not stated publicly, but the clear implication is the US would very much like the status quo to persist. Right? So, or, I can think of so many examples, or Somalia, where it's always the case that in some way, shape, or form, whatever the dispute is, whether it's the Somalian disputes with Somaliland, or whether it's the internal Somalian dispute, because there's never a shortage of those. There's always some sort of US funding available
Yes.
for conflict. There's always, like, that is never in doubt, right? No matter how low the HDI indices are, no matter how many people die of whatever it is they're dying of, no matter how miserable or how immiserated the country is, there's always money for war, and the money is always externally sourced. Right? So to me, it's clear that what the US government would like for the African continent is for it to be made up of, if possible, 100, 150 tiny, like, micro-ethnic, micro states. None of which will have any power whatsoever. All of them will have, like, the tiny little useless non-convertible currencies, because that is already the case. You have a continent which has 54 countries, which personally I already think is too many, has 35 currency zones, right? So as you move through Africa, you move through 35 currency zones, and all of these currencies are non-convertible with each other. So if you want to do any transaction across these currency zones, you're going to have to use US dollars as the bridging currency. That's how trade is carried out within Africa. So if I'm in Nigeria right now, I don't have the capacity to trade with someone in Kenya, except I use US dollars to trade. If I'm in Ghana, I don't have the capacity to trade with someone in Burkina Faso, which is literally next door. It's one border away from me. I have to use US dollars, because we all have we're all in different currency zones, 35 of them. That seems to be the way that the US government would prefer for Africa to remain: fractured, disjointed, disconnected from each other, unable to coalesce into something that is larger than the sum of its parts. And that's exactly where we are right now.
And the African Union, they don't bring this up, that it makes no sense.
Well, so the African Union supposedly has something called the Agenda 2063, which is meant to address all of this. So the Agenda 2063 is that by 2063, Africa should have a common currency.
If you said 2063, you have to wait 30 years, 40 years?
Supposedly, that's the policy. Supposedly. Now, as crazy as that will sound to you, it gets worse. Because even though all these supposedly Africa should have a open skies agreement, so the air travel becomes cheaper across the continent. Africa should have a free trade zone. It's called the AFCFTA, which supposedly has come into effect already, but on paper, not in practice. So supposedly rail and road links across the continent, all of this good stuff, right? Now, the problem with Agenda 2063 and the problem with the AU as a whole is that something like 80% of the AU's annual funding comes from outside of Africa, and most of it, by the way, comes from the EU. So that's exactly the problem. So if Europe, which obviously, if Africa were to put these proposals into effect, Africa would become a much, 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 much larger economy than Europe, and exponentially more powerful than Europe, right on Europe's southern border. So obviously, the Europeans have no incentive whatsoever to want to see these things happen. None.
Yeah.
So if the Europeans are the ones funding your premier continental institution, then it goes without saying that all of the funding mechanisms to put these policies into action, those mechanisms will never operate. And I'll give you a very clear example of this. I remember back in 2012, there was a proposal that was raised, in my opinion, a very sensible and obvious proposal for something called the AU passport. So the idea was that just like how it is in North America, where if you have a US or a Canadian passport, you can move through the entire North American continent seamlessly. You don't need a visa or anything like that, right? Or in Europe, where if you have a German passport and you want to go to Lithuania or the UK or Sweden or whatever, you don't need a passport. Right. You don't need a visa. Right? It's seamless movement. So the idea was create something called an AU passport, which can do something similar in Africa. Now, the idea wasn't that absolutely every Tom, Dick, and Harry should get an AU passport in Africa, because I also have to admit that might cause certain complications, especially where the institutions are not ready to deal with that sort of movement yet. But at the very least, some of the continent's most sort of economically relevant and important people. So if you've heard of somebody called Aliko Dangote, he's the wealthiest man in Africa. He's a Nigerian billionaire. I think he's worth $25.6 billion. And he made this famous statement in public where he said that even at his level, that just to travel around Africa, because his business empire is built primarily around things like cement and FMCGs and things like that across Africa. But just to travel around Africa, he needs 35 visas. Whereas,
are you serious?
Yeah,
Are you serious?
yeah, with his Nigerian passport, he needs 35 visas to travel around Africa. Meanwhile, so it was a very famous speech that he gave, because he was sitting next to this. It was like a business school. He was speaking to an audience, and he was speaking next to this white guy who's like the moderator, right? This white guy is not a billionaire. He's not a person of any significance. He's just a moderator, right? So he's saying, look, at my level, I'm the richest man in Africa. I need 35 visas to travel around my own continent. But John over here, who's just some random guy from France or wherever, John needs none. So this guy has more access to Africa than I do. And he's not a billionaire. He's just a random European guy.
Rando guy.
And he has more access to Africa than a billionaire who's worth $25 billion, because the billionaire happens to be Nigerian. So obviously that makes no sense. So the idea was that at the very least, people like that should have AU passports at the very least, right? Government officials, captains of industry, culturally significant people, musicians, people who need to move around a lot. And so the deadline that was given, or the date that was given for the launch of the AU passport program, was January 1, 2014. Well, today is August 18, 2025, and I can tell you that there is still no such thing as an AU passport 11 years later, 11 and a half years later. It just didn't happen. And the simple reason that it didn't happen was that the funding mechanism to put this AU passport program into action, it never came through, because the entity funding most of the AU's operations is the EU. And as far as the EU is concerned, it's not in their interest for Africa to open up to itself. It's not in their interest for Africa to become a single trading entity, and for the rate of intra-African trade to grow. Currently, Africa has the world's lowest rate of intra-regional trade by far. It's just 15%. Most of Africa's trade is bilateral and it's external, right? So in the US, you have a situation where I think something like, is it 35 or 40, correct me if I'm wrong, 35 to 40% of US trade is Pan-American in some way, shape, or form. Similar things in Europe. In Africa, it's just 15%. And Africa is a much larger continent than either of North America or Europe. So there's just an incredible amount of wealth that is being that the continent is just hemorrhaging on a daily basis, because instead of trading within itself, it's just constantly sending stuff out in exchange for US dollars.
Because look, I would tell you, under normal circumstances, it's believed that like railways, the ability to trade across borders. I mean, the entire point of the European, I know some people would disagree with this, but let's say the economic point, it's an economic program. We want the ability to cross borders, money to cross borders, people to cross borders, et cetera, because that makes it easier for you to get goods from point A to point B. If you're in a situation where it is, for me to get something out of my country to your other country, even though we're on the same continent, I have to have this pain in the ass.
Yeah.
It kills economic development.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, which is why the economic state of Africa that currently exists is not accidental. It's not because Africans, are not hardworking or are not innovative, or it's purely structural. It's entirely structural. If those fairly obvious things were to be put in place, things which are being actively obstructed by entities like the EU, if those things were to be put in place tomorrow, we wouldn't be talking about, a 40-year plan like China. We'll be talking about a 5 to 10-year transformation, economic transformation of the continent. It really wouldn't take that long. But the obstruction is a daily and ongoing thing. And the unfortunate thing is that there's this whole entire hidden infrastructure of global sort of political interference that makes it such that all of this is going on in the background, and you who lives in Africa is not even aware of it. Right? So for you to know what is going on, you have to be really, really tapped in to the system. Wow. You need to really understand, because you're not going to see this in a newspaper or on TV. These are not things that are discussed openly. So the narratives that you readily see plastered in front of your eyes every day, even as an African, is that Africa lacks innovation, Africans are not forward thinking, Africans are maybe a bit dumb and lazy or whatever. These are the narratives you get that are constantly fed to you on a daily, ongoing basis. It's like this huge, massive propaganda campaign, right? Well, you're never hearing about issues like why, for example, the AU's so-called Agenda 2063, why isn't even a 2063 agenda? Why wasn't it a 2016 or 2020? Why do you have to wait for somebody's lifetime to be able to get what people elsewhere already have today? What is the big deal, for example? What is the big deal about signing an open skies agreement? I'll tell you something else you don't know. If you wanted to fly from Accra to Nairobi, that's from Ghana to Kenya, the amount of money you would pay for the cheapest possible ticket is like $800. Now, for the equivalent distance in Europe, you'd pay about $350 for that flight. So Africa is by far the most expensive place to fly in the world. And it's more expensive to fly within Africa than to fly from Africa to another continent. It's actually more expensive to fly from Ghana to South Africa than it is to fly from Ghana to Dubai or from Ghana to London. That's the reality. Why is that the case? Because there are all these disparate tax jurisdictions and things within the continent. There is no open skies agreement within the continent. It doesn't cost money to sign an open skies agreement to harmonize all these tax issues so that the price of travel can come down. But all you will ever hear is that the reason that this agreement has not been signed is because African leaders are incompetent, African leaders are corrupt, African leaders are lazy and stupid, and they don't understand the issues and yada. That's what I've been hearing since I was a child. And then when you get older and you get tapped into the system, you realize that's not what's going on at all. African leaders are entirely aware of what they should and should not do, ideally. The problem is that there's a whole hidden international infrastructure of interference that ensures that they do not do the things that they're supposed to do. And then if you talk about it, the other thing that is instantly trotted out is that, oh, you're blaming white people for your problems. You're not taking responsibility and yada, 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 or, the usual stuff. You're a conspiracy theorist. And this stuff exists. And if you're tapped into the system, and I don't mean becoming the president. I mean, just maybe a journalist, a researcher, you kind of have a basic handle on what is going on. You realize very quickly that this is what is going on. So it's not as if this continent is just poor by default. This continent is being actively impoverished.
See, there's the rub. And then you take it in your own hands, like Ibrahim Traore, and they're like, oh my God, it's a junta.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
Dude, you can't have it both ways, right?
Exactly.
Either the system needs to be broken because it's a democracy in name only, where the democracy is trying to maintain a global order that is not in our best interest. It's a systemic issue. Or you do something that is in your own best interest as a country. You can't have it both ways. Yeah. I get it. I totally get it. I have to bring you back on because I want to delve into this stuff. Because look, you're right. If other countries uses terrorism in order to undermine their capability for cohesion, okay, well, that's not you. That's other countries that are intruding into politics.
Exactly.
If you have, or if other countries have a vested interests that are, let's say, much larger, that have maybe a colonialist influence on the country, and things like open skies, things like the ability to have cohesion among the country. 2060 is insane. That's like 40 years. It's like, yeah, we'll get to this in 40 years. Okay, how does that make sense? When you're looking at Europe, you're looking at North America. They did that because it was in our best interest to do that for reasons of economic development, political cohesion, to prevent wars, those type of things. The entire European Union, part of it is, let's not have another European war. These were bad ideas.
Exactly. Yeah.
So no, I totally get where you're coming from. That's aggravating. I totally get it. I got to bring you back on, man. Thank you for this. I really do appreciate it. David,
thank you for having me.
Hundeyin. Did I nail it? Did I get that right?
Hundeyin.
Hundeyin. Thank you. Hundeyin.
Yeah.
Hundeyin. Okay. David Hundeyin.
Close enough.
He is investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of the West Africa Weekly, and 2023 James Curry Fellows at Cambridge University. Thank you for this, man. I really do appreciate it. Great breakdown, by the way. Fantastic breakdown.
Thank you for having me.
You be safe.
Yeah.
All right. Great new guest. Oh, that's a great new guest. It's like you're just sitting there listening, like, tell me more, tell me more. Greatly appreciate him. Greatly appreciate him. That was a fantastic breakdown of Sudan, fantastic breakdown of what is taking place in Africa as a whole. He has my appreciation for that. I got to bring him back. I got to bring him back. His name is Phonetic. Phonetic, depends. I mean, Hundeyin. Depends on how you pronunciate the E. Pronounce the E. I don't know how. I mean, I can't look at it and just immediately know how the E is pronounced. Great guess. Great guess. Great guess. I'm enamored by that guess. All right, let's go to the chat. Jabari VOC Media, Zelensky crying in the middle of the night. Dale, yeah, I got to imagine that was not the phone call that he wanted. Look, one or two things we will find out to be true. Either the more cynical people are right. I don't think the doves are right. Meaning, I don't think the people with the most optimistic point of view are right. I just think they're wrong. Either the war continues or they get a deal. Those are the two options, right? If the war continues, there's several reasons it can continue. It could continue because the U.S. presents something where the Europeans balk at, Zelensky balks at. The Zelensky balking at something is just amazing to me, but whatever, let's go with the idea. In which case, the war continues. Trump could threaten to walk, in which case the Europeans, on some level, back away, or the Europeans hold their grounds. Again, I don't know how they do that, considering the reality on the ground, but they could. They're delusional, right? And maybe you need to get to a point where Ukraine is on the breaking point for them to acquiesce. Maybe, who knows? But either way, either the war continues or Russia keeps pressing their advantage. Ukraine keeps losing more and more people at a faster rate. And Donbass, within the course of the year, will be in the Russian pocket. There's that. Or they accept some kind of deal. It's one or the other. We will find out. So, yeah, what's Zelensky crying in his coffee? A man with no future? Yes, agreed. Wandi USA asks Brian if he read policies on how the USA is handling. I think that is supposed to be original or Aborigine U.S. Americans. O'Brien did hit that one. Wandi. Sparky. Question. Brian, now that Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali have gotten together, shouldn't Cote d'Ivoire make a deal as their path to the sea before Ghana beats them to it to supply gold for Gold Dome? Here's the thing. So I think I may be able to answer that one, kind of. When Kofi was here, Kofi did talk about Cote d'Ivoire. Kofi always talked about Cote d'Ivoire as a haven for either the French or the Americans, and that any kind of terrorist operations that are taken out of Cote d'Ivoire. That's the way he's talked about it. So he has never, since he's been on the show, talked about them as being an independent actor. He's talked about them as being a spoiler. Next time he comes on, we can bring Cote d'Ivoire up. But that's how Kofi has always talked about him. So, but Sparky, thank you. Veritas Ad Astra. Yo, I'm glad you finally got David on. David is great. He's a really good guest. He is a really good guest. Veritas Ad, Ethiopian government is seeking war with Eritrean to gain sea access. Oh, don't tell me this again. And Eritrea allied themselves with those rebels in the north of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, another vassal. Don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. If you remember, Ethiopian government, when it was attacked by the TPLF, guess who came to their aid? Eritrea. Abiy Ahmed got the Nobel Peace Prize for making peace with Eritrea. I don't want to hear these guys back in war. That's not what I don't want to hear that. Don't want to hear that. Hung Meow. Let's see. What are your plans for more African journalists? What do you mean? What are your plans for more African journalists? Hung Meow, what does that even mean? You mean, do I plan to have more on? I'm always looking for new guests. I'm always open to new guests. If there are African journalists that I can find, I'm welcome, more than welcome to have them. Look, if you've noticed, I will have people on my show with diametrically opposed positions. I have no issue with that. They're giving out their point of view. I have no idea. I have my points of view. I have things that I think are more right or more wrong, which is why I always end up arguing with my guests. It's like, why are you arguing with your guests? Why don't you just let your guests talk? You see them in the comments all the time. Why don't you let your guests talk? I just want to hear monologue. It's like, dude, you're watching the wrong show. You're watching the wrong show. Go. There are plenty of other shows where people would say just out their stuff, and the host just, okay, let me ask my next question, because I am not really internalizing what you just said. This is not that show. This is not that show. The show is named Jamal Thomas. I will debate with my audience. I will debate with my guests. It is what it is. If you hate that, sad day. Sad day. You can always start your own channel with whatever your name is, and you can sit there and do exactly what some of those other hosts do and just listen to their guests. It should be interesting. I didn't start this channel because I thought it was going to be a channel. I didn't. I had no idea this was going to be a channel. This ended up being kind of just, it has my name on it. It's not like Dialogue Works, who has a fantastic show, by the way, where it's specific to a thing. The show's named Jamal Thomas. Built my own channel because it was my own channel. It just became this. When I talk to people, I talk to them because it's interesting for me to talk to them. That's it. There's no magic. That's the magic, if there's any magic. So when I'm enjoying a guest, I'm enjoying a guest. When I'm having a conversation, it's because the things I want to know, the things I'm trying to get to in that conversation. I understand that there's some people who just want a monologue. That was never the point of the show. It's conversation. There's some people who, like this guest, like David, where you're just kind of fascinated by the conversation. Well, the only thing you do is shut up and listen. It was like, okay, tell me more. I'm listening. I'm your humble pupil. In other ones, you're trying to get to something. You're trying to understand something, and poking and pushing and prodding the guests is the way that you understand it. Otherwise, you're not gonna, the stuff that you miss. So, long story short, that's a lot of wood to chop. Yes, I'm always open to have additional African guests. Variation point of view, I don't care. I mean, granted, there's going to be some stuff I'm like, this person is out of their minds. But yeah, I'm always open to it. But I'm always open to more Chinese guests, more Thailand guests. I mean, it kind of depends on what's taking place around the world. Usually the conversation has to be contextual. But Jonet has asked about Sudan for a very long time. And when I got the opportunity to scratch that itch. Scratching that itch. So, shout out to David. Fantastic guests. Great explanation. Fantastic breakdown. Like I said, we used to cover the war when I was doing the channel at the network. And it never fully made sense. There was all this kind of assumption of, this is weird. And, you know, when you put it in perspective, like if you're covering Syria, or if you're covering Russia, or if you're covering some of these other conflicts, you can see the hidden hand because you cover it. Africa, on some level, can be a black box. And I don't mean that as a, no pun intended in that. I mean it in the way that it's colloquially meant. Like, it's not something that often gets covered in mainstream media. And so you have to seek it out in order to figure out what's going on. I remember my doctor, I love that woman. She's a firecracker. Well, she used to be my doctor when I was in the States. It is a bad idea to develop political conversations with your doctors. I'm just telling in advance. Relationships should be specific to what they are. If you are in a relationship with a female, do not bring business into it. Leave it out, leave it out, leave it out. It's going to create contradictions. If you are dealing with somebody in your life that has a very specific role, stay with that role. That is my advice as an old man. I have a birthday coming up. I'm August 31st. I'm going to be very old. And looking back over your life, those are things that you learned, that you value, that you learn, and that you wish you would have learned earlier. It saves you a lot of grief. It saves you a lot of complications. Specificity to a thing. It's kind of like software. Build a function. That function is specific to a thing. It's a subroutine. You do one thing. That is your job. And I know the human body does multiple things, but God is different, right? Nature and God is different. Her husband, I forget which part of Africa she was from. Her husband was still in Africa. And I remember when we used to get into these conversations about Gaza, she would be like, well, why don't you care about, the Congo? And it's like, where the hell do you think we get Congo news from? Like you're coming after me for not giving a shit about this thing that I know nothing about in the current context. You're from Africa. Of course you would know that. So of course that would be on your mind more so. It is not an indictment to care about one issue, nor does caring about one issue undercut or subvert another issue. If I am not aware of it, then I'm just not aware of it. That God, man, that used to be such an annoying refrain. In that sense, it's like, dude, why are you giving me shit about this? How would I know that that's an issue? Well, you didn't look. Exactly. I didn't look. It didn't come up on my view. I do not go out looking for random issues around the globe that I can effectively feel some kind of way about. I'm open to that stuff. But this show covers war politics. And usually it's something that's on the marquee because you have to kind of go with the flow of traffic. In a sense, you're just kind of stuck with the algorithm. But something invariably happens everywhere. I am firmly convinced that Africa is going to be more of a geopolitical player, especially with a second world order or secondary economic and most likely security order that develops around BRICS. I suspect that Africa is probably going to, countries will move into it. I could be wrong. I could be talking to my ass. But obviously, I guess it's not obvious, I suppose. But yes, I would be looking for more African journalists if they show up. I don't know who turned me on to David, but thank you for doing so. Yeah, thank you for doing so. Thank you for doing so. Hung me out. Do you have any plans to travel to China? I wish. I wish, God, I wish. If I could afford that trip, I would take that trip in a heartbeat. Keep in mind, I'm in Malaysia, not because I'm vacationing. I'm in Malaysia because it's my way of cutting costs, isolating myself to grow the channel. It's a drastic, seemingly dramatic, I suppose, but albeit logical move in order to save and grow simultaneously. Trips are justified by whether or not they safe and whether or not they are cost feasible in a sense. It's not like I'm at the radio station anymore where you're doing pretty well financially, you get vacations and everything else. I would love to go to Victory Day Parade. I wanted to go to Moscow's Victory Day Parade. God, I would have given my left testicle to go to Moscow's Victory Day Parade. Okay, maybe not. But I really deeply wanted to go. I have delved so much into that war that going was just something I wanted to do. China's what? It's going to be September 3rd, I believe. A friend of mine and I, work colleague. Well, it's not work colleague. She is a professional friend. I'll say it that way. We were thinking about going, but that's going to be damn expensive, especially on that day. So the answer is going to be no. I guess for me, I'm closer to China, so it's a little bit cheaper for me to go. But the issue is hotels, costs, those type of things. It's one thing if you also China's a pain in the ass to try to find somewhere to rent. You can rent properties for about 600, give or take, depending upon where you are, how close you are to a city. That would be for the month. Short-term stays are more expensive. That's a lot. Long story short, no. Long story short, no. Long story short, I'm going into a whole story about it. All of you, thank you. Jabari, Sparky, which is this one? Wandy, USA, Veritas at Astra. Why is that familiar to me? Why is that familiar to me? It's familiar to me. It'll come to me at some point. And Hung Meow, which is a completely funny name to me. I love that name. It sounds very dirty. All right. You all have my deepest appreciations, and I thank you for that. And for anybody else, you can always support the channel. PayPal, Patreon, Super Chats, memberships. Buy me a coffee. All of these things are appreciated. All of these things help. All of these things help the channel grow. There are things that I want to do with this channel, like producer, editor, mostly producer. Sometimes. Yeah, the producer, because most of my day is spent doing the mechanics of the show. And sometimes it helps to have somebody to push back on when you're doing this stuff. All right, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. I want to thank all of you for joining me. We had a power show today. I think we had like 1,200, 1,300, give or take. Shout out to Mark, shout out to Brian. Love their takes. We're going to see if this stuff comes to pass and what comes to pass on this. And of course, as you grow as a political analyst, the stuff is going to inform your point of view, where you can look back on it with historical context, because that meeting between Trump and Putin was historic. Just like the meeting between Biden and Putin, it was historic, even though nothing came of it. We will see if the US considers itself in a deleterious situation on the Ukrainian battlefronts, to the point they are willing to effectively have a tactic backtrack. We will see whether or not they push their client regimes or client states, Zelensky and their client morons in Europe, to basically back and push them into a security architecture. We'll see, and we will see together. So you all have a fantastic day. Jamal Thomas Morning Show, episode 217. 217 of these. We have been doing this show for what? 6 months, 7 months, 8 months? November, probably, let's say December. So yeah, nearly 9 months. Let's keep it going. Have a fantastic day, guys. I'll see you bright and early in the morning. Thanks all.